Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? I call the member for Melbourne.
Deputy Speaker. Earlier this month, I was lucky to attend the local Lunar New Year festival in Victoria Street, Richmond, in my electorate. I try to get down to the Lunar New Year festival most years, as it's always a spectacular display of dance, music and food, and it shows off the bustling energy and activity of Victoria Street. I think it's fair to say that the Victoria Street Business Association outdid themselves this year as we welcomed in the Vietnamese Year of the Cat. My kids and I spent the day watching mesmerising lion dances, a martial arts performance and a Vietnamese traditional Ao Dai fashion show, all whilst enjoying delicious foods like the Toi Ga, a Vietnamese red sticky rice dish which I'm still thinking about days later. This event, now in its 23rd year, was a truly inspiring display of Vietnamese culture, and the Victoria Street Business Association should be congratulated for their tireless efforts in putting together yet another memorable day of events. The cat is the fourth of the zodiac signs, and I read that the Year of the Cat is predicted to be a year of hope, something which I think most of us could use at the moment. I'm always honoured to share in the celebrations of our vibrant Vietnamese community in Melbourne, and I look forward to attending Tet next year. I'm extremely lucky, as the member for Melbourne, to represent such a diverse electorate with so many local groups, many of whom have a proud history of working within the community to provide the support and services local people need in culturally safe and accessible places. One such organisation is the Australian Vietnamese Women's Association, which this year celebrates its 40th year. Could not possibly relay all of the services that the AVWA provides to the Vietnamese community in Melbourne in the limited time that I have to make this speech, but let me tell you that the amount of work they do is monumental. To give you just a glimpse into their work, the AVWA provides support to young children, to the elderly, to people doing it tough with substance and gambling addictions, and to people experiencing family violence. They provide social support, NDIS support, and support to Indo-Chinese prisoners. At the heart of the organisation is the founder, President and previous long-time CEO, Ms Kam Nguyen. Kam and her family moved to Australia in 1976, and she became a teacher and then a principal at the Adult Migrant Education Service in St Albans. It wasn't long before she decided to set up an organisation which would assist newly arrived Vietnamese refugees, many of whom had experienced significant trauma before arriving in Australia. Kam and those at AVWA have always understood that refugees and asylum seekers add tremendous value to our society and deserve protection and support when they come to Australia. It's a privilege to witness the incredible work that AVWA does every day to support our community, and I know that my electorate is much richer and stronger because of the Australian Vietnamese Women's Association. Congratulations on 40 amazing years.
Thank you. The member for Tangi. The member for Tangi.
Thank you, Deputy Madam Speaker. I recently had the Prime Minister come and visit my electorate of Tangi. It is always a privilege to have the Prime Minister come to your community. Thankfully, Perth put on its best weather to welcome our leader to Western Australia. I was suffering with COVID for the previous 10 days. It was the second time I caught the virus, and it hit me really hard. I couldn't celebrate Chinese New Year and was confined in isolation until the Prime Minister's visit. We brought in the Year of the Rabbit, which to Chinese people represent hope, peace and prosperity. This is what the Albanese Labor government represents to Australian families. With any new year come new opportunity, and I have been telling my constituents the Albanese Labor government means a lot of new opportunity for the Australian people and the people of Tangi. I took Prime Minister Albanese to a local coffee shop in Point Water in Tangi. I was so proud to introduce my boss to my wife, my daughters and my granddaughter Alina. I know that our government will deliver on its promise of closing the gender pay gap for women like my daughters and my granddaughter, and create a better future for them and all Australians. Members of this place know that I speak often about the many multicultural communities of Tangi. I was pleased to introduce the Prime Minister to some of these community leaders. I thank Prime Minister Albanese and his staff for being so generous with their time on their visit. He met many community leaders in Tangney, and among them were the representatives of the Malaysian, the Indonesian, Chinese, and Indian communities. He took many photographs with them and had some very positive conversation with all of them. When former Prime Minister Morrison came to Perth in March 15, 2022, he avoided taking photos with the Chinese Australian in Western Australia. There is a clear change between the Albanese Labor government and the Morrison government, a change in the way Australia and the Prime Minister engage on the global stage, and a change in the way that the Prime Minister engaged with multicultural Australians on the ground in community like Tangney. I really appreciate the Prime Minister spending time being accessible and spreading some of his love in my electorate. The people of Tangney are already looking forward for his next visit. Thank you.
Thank the member and call the member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I'd like to speak about a constituent in my electorate of Capricornia, Mrs Rose Swadling, OAM, who was awarded an Order of Australia in January. Rose is a stalwart of the Rockhampton community and a very deserving Australian to receive such a high honour. When Rose heard she was awarded the OAM, her first comments were, "There are more deserving people than me." Growing up in Rockhampton, one of her first community projects she was involved in was with the Salvation Army at the age of 9. Rose remembers being inspired to serve her community by the then Mayor Rex Pilbeam when Rockhampton was experiencing the flood of 1954. Mr Pilbeam visited her home and others living in the flooded suburb of Depot Hill by boat to make sure they were safe and deliver bread and milk. This one act of kindness by the Mayor would lead Rose down the path of serving the community she so loves. Encouraged by her husband Graham and a number of friends, Rose ran for a place in council. In 1994, Rose was sworn in as a councillor to Rockhampton City Council. It was here that she would serve her community for 26 years. Rose saw Rockhampton through floods and droughts, de-amalgamations and amalgamations, saw mayors come and go. Yet Rose was the stability and constant for the residents of the Rockhampton region. It shows her character that during the 2012 council election, Rose was elected unopposed, and it shows her character that no one would run against her. Rose was well known for saying, "I'm into people, not politics." This saying is something that has stood by her through her life. Rose has dedicated her life, much of her time, to many community groups: Neighbourhood Watch Rockhampton, Crime Stoppers, Australian Red Cross, Mount Archer Lions Club, Victims of Crime Association, Glenmore Community Service Club, Capricorn Citizens Advocacy Committee, members of the Rockhampton Auxiliary for Royal Flying Doctor Service, and as a patron for many other community organisations. She has always lobbied for members of the community, some of our most vulnerable, the veterans, the elderly, Indigenous and multicultural communities. Her belief that the broader community has much to learn from these people has shone through with everything that Rose puts her hand to. Many people across the Rockhampton region have experienced Rose's care and thoughtfulness, with her talent for leaving anyone she meets feeling like they're the most important person in the room. On a personal level, I have worked with Rose over the past 10 years as the federal member for Capricornia. Rose has always guided and advised me throughout difficult times. I love that she's so dedicated to the community. She loves them and they love her. There is something truly amazing about a person who can dedicate so much time and support to an organisation, let alone as many as Rose does. On behalf of my constituents, thank you, Rose, for your tireless dedication to our community. You have left a great legacy in our region. Thank you.
Thank you. The member for Fenner.
Deputy Speaker, I rise to pay tribute to two Canberrans who recently passed away, Anne Harding and Radovan Lejovic. Anne Harding founded NatSem, the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling, in 1993 over a fish and chip shop. She later settled into an $11 million state-of-the-art building on campus, and her legacy lives on in the name of the Anne Harding Centre. Anne worked on microsimulation and was made a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia in 1996 and the inaugural president and co-founder of the International Microsimulation Association. She served as the president of the ACT branch of the Economic Society of Australia and authored or co-authored over 300 books, chapters, articles, papers and commissioned reports. NatSem did critical work in policy and was constantly serving on academic and government boards, including the Department of Social Security, Treasury, Health, Housing and Community Services. I remember meeting Anne for the first time in the 1998-99 discussions over the introduction of a goods and services tax. I was then working for the late Senator Peter Cook, and as I brought her up for the hearings, she said to me, "You know, you Labor people will come to like this tax because it'll allow you to spend what you need on health and education." Anne always had a ready wit and a generosity of spirit and helped many in NatSem, including yourself, Deputy Speaker. She was generous to me too, as a young economist. Radovan Lejovic was born in Yugoslavia in 1927. He yearned to escape and as a teenager decided that if only he could be selected to represent Yugoslavia in the European Games, he'd be able to get out. But he wasn't quite good enough, so he did something else. He got hold of a national team uniform, travelled to the north of the country where the Games were held, and then, wearing a national uniform, rode with the peloton over the border, where he escaped and ultimately made his way as a refugee to Australia. He became a regular in the Canberra triathlon scene, receiving the Legends of the Sport Award from Triathlon ACT just last year, aged 95. As recently as 2018, he was running, cycling or swimming every day and said that he was, quote, all the time warm and all the time ready to race. My friend Alex Gosman said of Rad, "I can remember Rad always being one of the last to leave after a race as he stayed around to help pack up. Rad always gave 100%, never complained and had a smile and a hello for everyone." Triathlon is an extraordinarily competitive sport, but triathletes are generous to one another. And Rad was the epitome of a sport that combines endurance and generosity to your fellow competitors.
I thank the member and call the member for Barara.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. In recent weeks in the Barara community, we've had the opportunity to welcome Andrew Kyrios to be the new Anglican minister at Cherrybrook Anglican Church and to farewell Reverend Jeff Smith, who has concluded 11 years as the minister at Galston Uniting. Freedom of worship is central to who we are as Australians, and it's always a joy to share with communities of faith as they celebrate a moment in their life together. Jeff Smith is a particularly special fellow. He not only served the Galston Uniting Church community, but he's been so much more than just the minister. He's been a mentor to young people. He's been a great football coach. He's chaired the local childcare and steered it through the difficult period of COVID-19. He's involved himself with a myriad of community activities, from the Galston schools to the Anzac Day commemorations and the Galston concerts. He's made an outsized contribution to our community. People across our community will miss Jeff with his big heart, his warmth, his kindness, and his desire to see the church as a place that's integrated and connected to community. On behalf of everyone in the Barara community, I want to wish Jeff well as he moves to live and serve in Parramatta. We're fortunate to welcome Reverend Andrew Kyrios and his family to Cherrybrook Anglican, and I look forward to time with Andrew and building a friendship with him over the years ahead. Cherrybrook Anglican is a very different sort of a church. It's a church community without a building. They meet in the Cherrybrook Community Centre or the Cherrybrook Sports House. Andrew comes to Cherrybrook Anglican after several years at Sanssouci, and many of his former parishioners in Sanssouci gave the GPS a good workout finding the way from Sanssouci to Cherrybrook to see him installed in his new role. Andrew was installed by the Reverend Chris Edwards, the Bishop of North Sydney. He's the first rector I've ever known who's got an economics degree, so I'm sure that the church books will be well balanced. Not only does he come to serve the community, but he brings his beautiful family, his wife Sally and his 4 children, George, Thomas, Anastasia and Theo. On behalf of our community, I want to welcome Andrew and his family to our beautiful part of Sydney. I want to take a moment to honour all the faith leaders of our community. I have 73 churches, temples or mosques in the electorate, and I'm grateful to all the men and women who choose to serve, often at cost, particularly in a time when communities of faith are perhaps less understood than they once were, although no less important. I'm also grateful for the congregations they lead. Whenever we speak of the good things that churches bring, we sometimes speak of their volunteers, their sense of service, and the ways they offer a helping hand in times of crisis. And we're right to consider these things. But I also think we should talk more about their understanding of the value of human life and the beauty of faith itself. Communities of faith understand human dignity, that every life has meaning, and that we're more than the sum of our possessions. I think the diversity of our faith communities and their strength in the Berowra community is one of the fundamental things that makes Berowra such a wonderful place to live. And it's always, for me as a Jewish Australian, such a privilege to involve myself in these special days of both welcoming and farewelling people in the Christian denominations who've made such an important contribution to our community.
Thank the member and call the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As we enter the 5th month of the Women, Life, Freedom protests in Iran event, more horrific accounts have emerged of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps beating, torturing and assaulting men and women arrested for exercising their human right to protest. This is the 4th time I've brought this to the Parliament's attention, and something I intend to continue to do, standing with the Iranian-Australian community in my electorate in Bennelong. More than 500 people have been killed by security forces since these protests began. 70 of them were children. 4 protesters have been executed, and at least 100 more face possible death sentences. Regimes that fear the power of public protest have in turn no recourse but to make the public fear the regime. This is why Iranian state security forces beat and torture prisoners, to terrify and to terrorise, to instil fear and to try and instil shame. But the shame is theirs and their regimes. The IRGC is a malignant actor that has long threatened security internationally, in its near region and, of course, within Iran. Its actions are unconscionable. 2 weeks ago, our Foreign Minister, Senator Penny Wong, announced additional sanctions on Iranian individuals and entities for abhorrent abuse of human rights. These included Magnitsky-style sanctions, including on senior law enforcement, political and military figures, some within the IRGC. And just 2 days ago, the Home Affairs Minister reiterated that the Australian government will not tolerate any attempts by the Iranian regime to disrupt peaceful protests, encourage violence or suppress views here in Australia, as they've been found to do. Nor will we tolerate hostile acts in the form of surveillance, harassment or intimidation against individuals or family members here in Australia. This government will not stand back and have Australians watched, tracked or intimidated by the Iranian regime. Additionally, Australia is joining partners to impose additional targeted financial sanctions on Iranian individuals and entities involved in the production and supply of drones to Russia. Iranian-made drones have been used by Russia to target Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. The government intends to employ every strategy at our disposal towards upholding human rights, ranging from dialogue and diplomacy to sanctions consistent with our values and our interests. I'd like to thank the Iranian-Australian community in my electorate of Bennelong for their ongoing advocacy and commitment to bringing this issue to my attention. I'll continue to be their voice here in this Parliament. Labor governments have a strong history of taking decisive steps on action with the IRGC and will continue to do so.
Thank the member. The member for Forrest.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to acknowledge Brian Peace, who passed away recently following a battle with liver cancer. Brian was dedicated to his family, his community. He was a stalwart of the Forrest Division of the Liberal Party, a member of the party for over 50 years, but a man who also gave countless hours of voluntary service across many sectors and interests throughout his life. He was strong, happy and passionate about what he believed in. He was never afraid to speak up, and he had the courage to speak up even if he was the only one with a different opinion. He gave countless selfless hours to local, regional and community groups and organisations, and he always showed up. And that included local government in agriculture, land management, regional development, port and transport, education, politics and numerous community groups, including long-standing memberships of Rotary and Apex. The majority of these roles were voluntary throughout his life, and he always in those meetings ensured that due process and meeting procedures were followed to protect the organisation. But wherever Brian and his wife Lucille and their family lived, he became involved with the community, but I know that one of the roles he really dedicated an enormous amount of time, energy and commitment to was his time serving as the president of the Donnybrook Baling Up Shire. He'd had a lot of previous experience in the Capel Shire, but saw this as a really important part of what he was able to achieve in life. He gave many, many years, as I said, to so many different groups, whether it was the Warren Blackwood Alliance of Council, Capel Community Groups, Edith Cowan University in the Southwest, the Agricultural Protection Board, C.Y. Conero Institute, Edith Cowan University, as I said, very important, Southwest Catchments Council. There was one after the other. The Kings Park Botanic Gardens. He was very, very committed to regional development through the Southwest Development Commission, and also spent a lot of time on Western Dairy. And that's on top of almost every position in the Forest Division of the Liberal Party itself. He was strong till the very end, fighting cancer with the same approach he took to life, interested and involved in community affairs right until the end. He lived a full active life, supported and loved by his wonderfully strong wife Lucille and his daughters Miranda, Janita and their family. As Abraham Lincoln said, in the end, it's not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years. Brian, may you rest in peace.
Thank the member. The member for Hasluck.
Thank you. The Albanese government understands the pressures that are being felt across Australia in homes, particularly in my electorate of Hasluck. I hear regularly from people who are experiencing particular cost of living pressures, such as pensioners who are nearly close to paying off their mortgage but not quite, and are now quite concerned about the interest rate rises and what that means for them, and young families who are just working hard to try and get ahead. So while the RBA will make its own decisions on how to manage the interest rate rise, we are delivering on our commitments that we made at the election to help reduce the cost of living. In education and training, for example, the government is providing 20,000 extra university places, and in my electorate of Hasluck, Curtin campus has a health science focus, so that will mean many, many students will be able to access a career pathway into the health. And additionally, with Midland TAFE as well, I'm lucky to have that in the Midland precinct, and the prospective students there will be benefiting from a number of fee-free places, as well as commitments to advanced technology in renewable manufacturing of wind turbines. So that's 180,000 fee-free places across Australia. Being able to step into a new job, upgrade skills, at no cost will be a way of getting ahead. In health, we know how much pressure there is on the hospital systems around the nation, and this is why the commitment, as we saw through the recommendations coming from the Strengthening Medicare Task Force report, will result in now there being more additional urgent care clinics, and for Midland we will have a return of fee-free bulk billing urgent care clinic, and I look forward to welcoming Minister Butler to the electorate to discuss that, but also the opportunity to have a second one out in the growth corridor of Ellenbrook. We need to take the pressure off emergency departments, and we know that that's the way forward to do so. Additionally, we've heard the great news that for the first time ever, we're getting a reduction in the PBS prescription costs. So that's the maximum co-payment is now dropping from $42.50 down to $30. That is a way of reducing the costs on individuals and families when it comes to their take-home pay. Early childhood education, so many wonderful young families across the electorate of Hasluck who are looking to get ahead, being able to return to the workforce early because you know that there's an opportunity for your children to be able to access early childhood education is that way. For my electorate, 5,000 families will benefit from being able to access affordable early childhood centres, and that's 1 million families across Australia. We also saw this week the Housing Future Fund.
Time has expired.
Oh, thank you.
I thank the member. The member for Riverina.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Volunteers are the lifeblood of all our communities, and today I pay tribute to the Citizens of the Year, those people who have led the way in the Riverina and Central West. In Bland Shire, Greg McIntyre for the past 15 years has created and sustained the Can Assist annual charity walk. It's one of Can Assist West Wyalong's biggest fundraising events, and a total of 943 walkers 391 kilometres and $310,000 raised. And well done, Greg. In Coolum Shire, Paul Horan leads the way. Ardlethan, born and bred, he's a long-term member of the local SES and he's fire captain for Beckham. He's involved with the Ardlethan picnics and the annual Ardlethan show. Cootamundra Citizen of the Year, Gary James, has spent 37 years contributing to his local RSL. President and other positions. He's also a big supporter of Legacy. Cowra Shire Citizen of the Year, Helen Horton. Thank you, Helen. She's a dedicated youth worker at the Cowra Information and Neighbourhood Centre. She helps youths get their lives back on track. In Forbes, Paul Faulkner led the way, and his community spirit during the recent flooding had to be seen to be believed. Gundagai Citizen of the Year, Phil Smith, duly recognised for being a stalwart of Can Assist in that wonderful town. He's helped to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars in awareness for cancer research, etc. Harden Citizen of the Year, Graham Taylor, a member of Murrumburra Harden Rotary Club for 40 years, involved with so many organisations in those twin towns. Harden Murrumburra Flexicare. He's helped out with his carpentry skills to construct backdrops and scenery for the Young Theatre Company. Junee Citizen of the Year, Gail Cummins. What a powerhouse and dynamo she is. Founder and chairman of the Junee Roundhouse Museum. She's also involved as president of Urungillis Country Women's Association. Keith Edgerton, Lockhart Citizen of the Year. Lockhart District Aged Care Association, stalwart for 30 years, a member of Lockhart Lions. He's done so many things with the Lockhart Bowling Club, Lockhart Ex-Servicemen's Club, Lockhart Local Health Advisory Committee. I could go on. Park Citizen of the Year, Bob Strickland. Bob has been tireless with his volunteering efforts with the Parks community, with the Police Citizens Club, the Centenary Committee, Care Flight, Southern Cross Village, Parks Community Choir and Parks Can Assist. In Temora, Ros Hartwig, and we thank her. She spent so much of her time with the Rotary Club, Quota Club, Red Cross. Wagga Citizen of the Year, Alan Potty. He's done so much for Wagga Wagga's Relay for Life, the Cancer Council. In Wedenshire, Glenn Ivans. I know Glenn well. He's done so much with Grenfell RSL sub-branch, becoming president in 2017. It's a position he still holds. And Young Citizen of the Year, Christine Burnett. She plays a major role in showcasing the region's vibrant art and cultural communities. As president of Hilltops Arts, I say to each and every one of them, thank you.
Thank you, member, and call the member for Eden Monero.
Thank you, Deputy Chair, and almost apt that I'm following the member for Riverina because I wanted to get up today and talk about Tumba Trek. Tumba Trek is an annual event which was started back in 1985 by Tim Fisher, a man who wanted to highlight the extraordinary surrounds of a place in the mighty Eden Monero called Tumbarumba, a place which is known for its absolute beauty, and every year we get to go along as the custodian of Tim Fisher's walking stick. I feel a great sense of responsibility. Tumba Trek was, of course, resurrected by the member for Riverina in his time representing Tumbarumba, the member for Riverina and I share a deep love of making sure that this trek continues on for many years. This trek this year, each year it changes its location. This trek this year was on part of the Human Hobble Track. 16.6 k's of mostly up and a little bit of down in the hills of Tumbarumba. It was enjoyed by 100 people, and a huge thank you to the Snowy Valleys Council for putting this on each and every year. They do so not to make a profit, they do so to carry on a legacy of the great Tim Fisher, and I want to thank everyone for being part of the day. It was extremely hot, about 36 degrees. And at the end of that 16.6k walk, everyone enjoyed the lunch and a cool drink down by the Tumbarumba Creek escape. So thank you to the member for Riverina for resurrecting it. It is a fantastic walk and I look forward to it continuing in 2024. The Murrum Bateman Wine Trail, fantastic project supported by $1 million from the Australian Government and $1.2 million from the Yass Valley Council. It is 10 kilometres of track which connects the town to multiple wineries in the region. And for those of you who don't know, in Murrum Bateman we have some of the best and well-known Canberra region wines. It will maintain and enhance the tourism and visitor experience there, but it also does something fantastic for our local community community. It provides them 10 kilometres of trail to walk on, to ride on, to push the pram on, to get out for a bit of exercise. And I want to thank the council and the councillors for working so closely with the Murrum Bateman community in making this dream a reality. That community is so fantastic. It works so closely together, but with the council to make sure that they can achieve their dreams of a better and more productive area, one which will attract more tourists and more people to come and live. If you haven't been out there, Murrum Bateman's 30 minutes from the ACT. Get out there. We know how amazing the region is, but for those of you who don't, the mighty Eden Monero will greatly accept your donations to a number of our businesses. There's something for everyone, and I urge you to visit those places close to us. Thank you.
Thank you to the honourable member. In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded. I call the clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 1, Governor-General's opening speech, resumption of debate on the proposed address and reply.
The question is that the address be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Indi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whenever I stand to speak as the independent federal member for Indi, I'm grateful to the people of our proud Federation seat who gave me the responsibility and the privilege of being their voice in this place. In 2019, when the people of Indi first elected me, they told me they wanted a different style of politics. They wanted integrity and trust returned, real action on climate change, and more opportunities for rural, regional and remote Australians. They wanted me to work for them, not for a party machine. In 2022, their message remained consistent with that. There was frustration at the lack of progress on climate change and a sense we were missing real opportunities to harness the transition to new renewable energy technology in rural and regional Australia. But the message that came through the loudest, the strongest, the most clear, on the street, at the footy grounds, in town halls, no matter what people's political persuasion was, they wanted us to be better representatives. More accountability, more transparency, more integrity. Keep going on integrity, Helen, I would hear. You get that commission, Helen. Clean that place up. I heard it everywhere. And I worked doggedly in the last parliament on that mission to implement a federal integrity commission. I met many times with the former Prime Minister, the member for Cook, many times to talk about my proposal and the need to allow debate on such a vital issue. But I was always told that this wasn't a major issue for Australians, that it wasn't a priority. Well, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that this was absolutely not the case. Integrity in politics and a better standard of behaviour are vitally important to Australians. And we can see in the election result, in the many new faces in this place, particularly sitting alongside me on the crossbench, that there are many, many Australians, most of us actually, who value integrity. I never doubted it. I'm proud that already in the first 8 months of this parliament, we have passed the National Anti-Corruption Commission, and the NAC will be in action later this year. And I'm proud of my role as the Deputy Chair of the committee that examined the bill and the improvements we made and the bipartisanship that we brought to that. And now, as the member for Indi, representing the people of Indi who called on me to do this work, I'm now the Deputy Chair of the Joint Standing Committee on the NAC. And I promise I will be an independent voice for integrity on this important oversight body. Because the work of integrity, of course, is never done. Now we have the Commission, it's not a case of just set and forget. And I want this government to know that I will be watching you closely. And in the same way that I spoke up to the former government when it fell short on integrity, I too will speak up if and when you also fall short of what Australians expect. Madam Deputy Speaker, as the independent member for Indi, I have the privilege of advocating for what my electorate really needs now and into the future. In the wake of the pandemic, I heard again and again of the need for better investment in our healthcare in the regions. I heard of the difficulty in getting an appointment with a doctor, of accessing the right specialist somewhere close to home, of accessing appropriate aged care services also close to where people have spent their lives. A major issue in the election campaign in Indi was funding for a new single-site hospital on the border in Albury-Wodonga, to ensure that the growing population across our region is properly served without the complication of services spread across the whole border region. I know the member for Robertson would understand this. People in rural and regional areas have to travel vast distances to get the kind of healthcare that people in metropolitan areas simply take for granted. The Victorian and New South Wales governments have since committed to redevelop the existing hospital site in Albury with a small amount of federal investment. And while the funds committed are well below what we as a community have asked for and need, I'm committed to work constructively with all levels of government, including this federal government, to ensure that our community gets the top quality health service we need and deserve. Under the Albury-Wodonga regional deal, $35 million will be directed to our local health infrastructure projects and for accommodation for workers in the health sector. This funding was promised in March 2022 before the election and then recommitted in the October budget, but it needs to be delivered urgently to allow these projects to start. I also commit to working with the government to secure funding for better health services right across Indi, including the redevelopment of the Bright Hospital Precinct, for better access to services for those suffering for eating disorders as well, young people in particular. The spike in eating disorders across the nation is extraordinary, and in rural and regional areas such as mine, access to services are almost non-existent. The psychologists, the healthcare teams across Indi tell me they simply can't keep up with demand and they don't have the resources they need to meet it. I really hope I can work with government on this one. Rural and regional young people in particular should not be left abandoned. As a former nurse and midwife and then a rural health researcher focusing on rural health and public health, I know the impact that a lack of access to proper health care has on people in rural and regional Australia. And just last week we learnt that women in remote areas are likely to die 19 years earlier and men in remote areas 13.9 years earlier than their city counterparts. I mean, this is simply unbelievable in 2023. It's not good enough. At every chance, I will be working to improve healthcare for people in regional, rural and remote Australia so that we can thrive right now and into the future. Surely this is not too much to ask. From big towns like Wodonga and Wangaratta to small towns like Corryong in the north and Alexandra in the south, people of Indi talk to me about healthcare and, gee, do they talk to me about the crisis in housing? Because this is the thing, all of these things are interrelated. We're currently experiencing an unprecedented level of housing demand and mortgage and rental stress. A study conducted by National Housing Welfare Organisation Everybody's Home in March 2022 found that 40.6% of renters in Indi experience housing stress. 40.6%. And 61.4% of homeowners in Indi were under stress with their mortgage. Now, that was last year. We haven't got the data for this year, but I know it will be worse. A lack of affordable housing has disastrous flow-on and economic impacts. If 10% of workplace positions can't be filled due to housing shortages, this flows on to a $200 million economic loss. The regions will lose tens of millions of dollars in economic activity if the housing crisis is not met. If we're going to improve housing supply, we need to build critical enabling infrastructure: sewerage, water, electricity. Without it, it doesn't matter how quickly councils approve lots for housing, they simply can't be built on. For Benalla and Wangaratta, the cost of enabling infrastructure is out of reach for a small council, and it's a complete handbrake on our housing supply. And as a parliament, we simply must address it. During the election, I campaigned for a regional housing infrastructure fund, a dedicated fund to build critical infrastructure which would help unlock more housing supply in regional Australia. Infrastructure from street lights and water supply to community centres and gardens. The government should work with me on this fund. I've spoken to the Housing Minister about it. I'll continue to. It's so important because if the government's own ambitious housing agenda to build 30,000 new social and affordable homes can be delivered, they need this enabling infrastructure. If it isn't there, I struggle to see how they could deliver on this election promise. The government's proposed housing legislative package seeks to provide an ongoing funding stream to build social and affordable Australian homes. And this fund, as we all know here, will cost $10 billion, the biggest government investment in housing for more than a decade. And with such an enormous amount of money on the table, I want to see legislation that explicitly considers both social and affordable housing and the critical enabling infrastructure to make it happen in regional, rural and remote Australia. Because addressing the housing crisis in regional Australia is the first step to addressing our other challenges: the economy, better healthcare, better opportunities. I've said it over and over and over here. We used to say, build it and they will come. Well, they've been coming and we haven't built it. None of our issues can be truly fixed if we don't have places for people to live. For regional and rural Australia to thrive, we also need to think about our local governments. Our councils need appropriate funding to support our growing and changing communities. In Indi, our 9 local government areas provide essential services with just small rate bases to call on in really challenging geography. Because of this, they rely heavily on the Commonwealth's financial assistance grants. And over the last 3 decades, grant payments have declined from 1% of Commonwealth taxation revenue to just 0.53%. And at the same time, the demands on councils have only increased. The number one ask from the 9 local governments of Indi, year in, year out, is to increase financial assistance grants. I was pleased to see the government have committed in its national platform to focus, I quote, to focus on the long-term financial sustainability of local government, including fair increases to financial assistance grants. So I say to you, we need to see a restoration of these grants to 1% of federal tax revenue. This is a fair increase. I've been pleased to meet with the Assistant Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories, herself a former mayor from a regional community, to make this case, and I truly hope she can do better than the previous government on this issue, so that our communities have the infrastructure they need. Madam Deputy Speaker, action on climate change is a real priority for the people of Indi. A huge priority for me. When I first ran for Parliament, people said, you can never get elected if you talk about climate change. Well, I'm back here again. Regional Australians understand this. That's why I'm here. Regional Australians are on the forefront of the impacts of climate change. But we also have the most to gain from smart, practical action to lower emissions and create new industries. Renewable energy is the cheapest form of power, and our country is blessed with the world's best supply of it. This could be our next gold rush in the regions, if we get it right. We must do much, much more to ensure that we take science-backed action on climate change, that we make sure that our communities truly benefit from the economic flow of taking that action. Because renewable energy could be a huge economic boom for regional Australia. Australia's regions have all the resources we need to fuel our energy future, powered by the sun and the wind. But we have to make sure that the profits from the generation of renewable energy in Australia aren't funnelled offshore. They must not be. We have to be certain that the communities at the point of generation of this new renewable energy truly benefit from it. The money needs to flow into the pockets of rural, regional and remote Australia. And that's why, in the last Parliament, I introduced a bill to create the Australian Local Power Agency, with a particular focus on regional communities, where energy reliability, stability and security is not always guaranteed, particularly in times of natural disasters. Now, the government has introduced the Community Batteries for Household Solar program, which is a good start to increase energy storage around Australia, to lower bills and emissions and take pressure off the grid. And that's why I've got to say it was very, very disappointing to me to see the first round of this funding, of this really important program, go to a majority of urban and metropolitan communities. Only 14% of communities who received a grant are in rural Australia. Now, I'm pleased that there's a minister sitting here right now, because I know that he knows that 30% of Australia's population actually live in the regions. To make matters worse, the electorates that received that funding are almost 60% of Labor seats. Now, I know the government will tell me this is an election promise. Well, make some election promises that benefit rural and regional Australians and that are equitable. It's not good enough by a government that promises transparency and equity. So do better in the next round. Community energy is not just about funding batteries. The time is now for the Commonwealth to scale up support for community-owned renewable energy. Across regional Australia, there are incredible examples of communities working together to own and share renewable energy. In Indi, we have the highest number of community energy groups of any electorate in Australia. Towns like Yakandanda, Euroa, Benalla, Mansfield, Corryong, Wodonga, to name but some. We are really good at this, but we need more support. Well, we actually need some support. There's genuine opportunity right now for government to review how ARENA can assist these groups. I've spoken to the Minister about this. It's really clear that ARENA is not providing funding to these kinds of projects, and I want to see that change. The rising cost of living is hitting households across Australia, including in my community of Indi, of course. Outside of mortgage and rental payments, the biggest bills Australians face are their energy bills. Now, the simplest way the government can assist in lowering both energy bills and emissions is to think domestically. Help households and businesses move towards electrification and lower emissions appliances. I brought a policy to the election which would reduce the cost of home batteries and offer no interest loans for low-income families to switch expensive old gas appliances like hot water systems and heaters to new, efficient electrical versions. Now, I didn't make this up. Countries across the world are doing this. We need to get on board. Australian households want to do this, but there's economic reasons that are holding them back. This is a really great opportunity. The government's considering a similar package to be included in the budget. My Cheaper Home Batteries bill that I introduced last year included a plan for no-interest loans as a way to make smart choices, not just for the environment, but for the household budget. And I plan on reintroducing this bill in this term of Parliament. And I really want to work with the government on this one. I think we could do terrific work on this, something that would really make a big difference to the home budget. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to talk about farming. Farming generates 16% of Australians' carbon emissions, with emissions rising by 3.3% in the year to September 2022. The government has signed our farmers up to hit net zero emissions by 2050, but it's given us very little in the way of actual policies, actual real support to reduce emissions. We've got to support farmers to reduce emissions, not just talk about them. Now, I grew up on a dairy farm, and I still raise cattle today. And as a member for a regional and rural electorate, I know how hard farmers work. And I know that they're always trying to do what's best for them and their land. But right now, it's way too confusing and difficult to get the right information and support about reducing emissions. We need to help our farmers protect their access to world markets by supporting them to lower their emissions and to certify their products as zero carbon. My plan would fund 200 agricultural extension officers around regional Australia who would help farmers one-to-one to lower their emissions, access carbon credits and hit net zero emissions. These extension officers would be qualified and trusted with the local knowledge to provide on-the-ground assistance to farmers. We've done this in the past when we've seen major transitions in agriculture. This stuff works. The government could then certify those farms as carbon neutral, which would then help them access price premiums for their products and protect their access to overseas markets. Now, I know this government is considering a range of different programs to reduce emissions in agriculture. An agricultural extension officer network is sensible, it's efficient, it's a location-appropriate pathway towards delivering these programs, and I really want to work with government on this. Madam Deputy Speaker, in closing, I want to say that as a rural and regional independent, a very, very proud one, I am determined to be a champion for the people of Indi and to bring the perspectives of regional Australia to this Parliament. I will continue to be a voice for integrity and transparency, and I will hold this government to account. Residents in Indi know that every time I stand in this place, I will be working to create a community where we have appropriate and accessible healthcare, aged care and housing. I will stand here for better phone and internet coverage, for safer roads, for action on climate change. I will be working every day of my term as the member for Indi to help our communities to thrive and to be the best that they can be.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I give the call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And I rise today as the member for Chifley. I was enormously humbled to be elected the first time in that capacity to represent communities I've grown up in and care about. And every single election where I'm given the opportunity to represent the community again means a great deal. There's a lot of communities in our part of the world, and in my part of Western Sydney, where it is hard to get the voice heard of people in our area. Some of the communities do it tough, but they're very proud communities, people that know that if they have the chance, they can show what they're made of, show what they can do, and improve the quality of life in neighbourhoods across Chifley. And I've always seen myself as being a part of that, being a servant of the people of the area that I represent, and being able to represent their views, their ambitions and aspirations in this Parliament, in a place where, when you take into account the number of people that have actually been elected to the House of Representatives relative to the size of the population, it's a small group of people. And I mention that because it emphasises, in my mind, and I'm sure in the minds of others, like the member for Robertson who's here today as well, the chance to be able, and like yourself, Deputy Speaker, the chance to be able to represent our communities, and to do so having the huge honour of being able to form a government where you're able to give effect in a much greater sense to what people want is huge. It's a massive honour. In my neck of the woods, in particular through the course of the last term of Parliament, we were hit hard by COVID, as a lot of others were, but there were communities in Western Sydney where we went through lockdown and where the failure of decision-making at a federal level hurt hard, triggered the lockdown, and also saw, and it's something that is hugely impactful on me when I consider that 60% of the deaths through the course of 21 were felt in Western and South-Western Sydney through the course of lockdown, through that Delta wave. We needed the vaccines that weren't there. As we got out of it, we needed rat tests to be able to get back to work. People prevented from being able to continue in their livelihoods. It enforced or emphasised to us the massive value in investing in healthcare, but there are a lot of communities in our area that are under pressure in getting particularly primary healthcare in a way that will help them do exactly what they want to do in their lives exactly as others are able. And it's either in the outer suburbs or in regional Australia, places away from the capital cities, where this is an even bigger challenge. And for me, there are a number of things that I wanted to canvass in my contribution to the Governor-General's opening speech. But particularly healthcare was the big one that I wanted to kick off, because we don't want to. We've gone through the seismic event of a pandemic. We said that there were lessons to be learned. It's now time to do just that. And so we've seen Medicare is under huge pressure. It didn't just happen overnight. This has been essentially a underinvestment in primary care, and in terms of recognising and respecting the role of GPs, general practitioners in communities, and particularly in my area, when I look at communities from Lethbridge Park, Bidwell, Wayland, Tregear, Mount Druitt, who really do need to be able to see a doctor and not do so on the basis that they're making a calculation about whether or not they can afford to do so. We are rightly proud as a country in Medicare providing universal access, but that universal access is under huge pressure. And I'm seeing in parts of Western Sydney where people are being asked for the first time to pay to see a doctor. That is a symptom of neglect that has been there, a failure to keep pace with what is going through. And it's doctors, GPs saying to me, and I certainly understand from the doctors I speak with in my area, they're under huge pressure. Their costs have gone up as inflation has soared, and Medicare hasn't kept pace with that, and it's impacting on their ability to provide healthcare at that point in time where it matters most, and where also it could be hugely beneficial from a preventative aspect as well, of being able to identify issues that might cause longer-term health problems for individuals in my area, for people in the communities I represent. We need a strong Medicare system, and it is, again, I come back to the point, being in government where you can make a difference is a huge honour, and seeing our colleague, the Minister for Health, Mark Butler, take this issue on board, recognising, importantly, what we need to do to invest in Medicare. There's a lot of work to do there, but I'm sure that he is determined to make a difference, because if we don't have improvement in that, in community care in particular, and people being able to see their GP in their local area and get the type of advice and support they need at the time that they need it most, does have consequences. For example, in Blacktown and Mount Druitt, our hospitals, you see what happens if people can't go to a GP, they turn up at an emergency department. And Blacktown and Mount Druitt Hospital, it's enormously upsetting to know, has the worst treatment response time for emergency patients in Sydney. And last year there were instances where there wasn't enough space for some patients wanting treatment at Blacktown Hospital's emergency department. And I've heard several times we have quality health services in New South Wales, but patients needed to camp outside their hospital. Some patients who needed emergency treatment had to wait on the footpath up until midnight. We know that timely response in hospitals is critical to the survival in some cases. So residents in our part of Western Sydney being told wait at the back of the line is simply not good enough, and we need to make sure that all parts of the health system are working in a way that avoids that, because when you get to that point, it's not just an issue about, it's wrong to think that it's just a problem at that hospital. There is something underlying that situation that needs to be dealt with. From my point of view, as a member in this place, making sure that we have all those pieces locked in place that can deliver affordable, accessible healthcare for people at the time they need it most is hugely important. And I do want to thank the doctors and the GPs in my area, along with everyone that works with them in their practices and in those medical centres, for delivering the support that they need. And I've already started representing the concerns of those GPs in being able to get the support they need in their practices, or getting doctors too, because we have shortages of GP numbers, and that's playing out in our part of the world. The other area that I wanted to touch on in terms of education too, the big thing for people in our area is recognising the value of education in changing their lives and opening up opportunity. We have a very young population, a lot of students in schools, and particularly, if I may say, government schools in my area, who I always enjoy at the end of the year going to the assemblies, the presentation assemblies, to see the way that they're going. We do need to make massive investments and work with state governments in terms of what will happen with schooling support longer term, and in my area, making sure that the school resources standard that we see a lift in the investment, because I do know, talking with principals in my area, particularly, for instance, I've spoken with principals out in parts of Doonside where they've said that the additional investment saw a transformation in results, for example, in maths, where they could provide one-on-one student support outside of classrooms. And I also know that access to technology, through the course of the pandemic and the lockdowns, there were schools in my area where Year 12 students performed their best relative to other generations, defying expectation that the lockdown would affect them, but that was largely leveraged off them being able to get access to a laptop and mobile coverage. And you could see where that wasn't available and where learning couldn't occur through lockdown, you could see the results in others who didn't have that access. And in Year 10 performances, or Year 10 performance, I should say, you could see the impact of not having that technology. So ensuring that that investment's there is really important. I'm very proud, as I'm sure a lot of people are, a lot of my colleagues are, that we've committed, for instance, on vocational education, making sure TAFE gets the backing that it needs. And it's been one of the great things that we have really backed in, the value of TAFE, and talked it up. For too long it's been seen as the poor cousin. It's not that. It's very important in delivering the skills that businesses need and opening up a career for people where they really want to throw themselves into it. Our government is committed to close to 500,000 TAFE fee-free places. That's a big deal for people in our area, providing skills that businesses need. But again, I come back to that point, opening up a career for people that means a great deal. And on top of that, the commitment that we've made to invest in more university places and given both the opening up the existence of Western Sydney University, Australian Catholic University is opening up campuses to their great credit in Blacktown as well, making sure that people from underrepresented groups have access to university education is something I'm enormously proud of that is being opened up by our government, and look forward to championing that as well. Infrastructure is another huge issue. Our part of the world is expected to welcome nearly 200,000 new residents in our outer suburbs, and while there are some state governments that love to cheer on the opening of huge tracts of land, believing that this will deal with housing supply, and they take the stamp duty that comes with that and they pocket that very nicely, but there seems to be a difference between the speed at which they take the stamp duty and then the turning around of that into an investment in infrastructure. So in our part of the world, major roadways like the Richmond Road leading into Marsden Park, where there is huge frustration by people that we haven't got things right, linking in infrastructure, and why people can't believe that you could have all these new homes appear and the infrastructure hasn't kept pace with what people would expect would occur. And we certainly, as a government, committed to work with the New South Wales government on different stages, for instance, on that particular road, on Richmond Road, and we committed money to ensure that that was available for that planning work, design work to happen. But as residents rightly say in my neck of the woods, a plan's great, but you can't drive on it. And they're right. Like, you can talk that talk, but you've got to be able to drive that road, frankly, if I can belabour a pun. And I understand that the design work has been done to improve bottlenecks and pinch points on major roadways in my area, like Richmond Road, and yet we have to wait for a state election for a decision to be made about investment, which is frankly hugely disappointing and outrageous, because people shouldn't be tethered to an election to see whether or not they'll get the infrastructure that they need to make their lives easier, so they're not stuck in traffic and that they can get to and from work quickly. And importantly, that business and industry in my area can open up, that it's not just homes that are opened up where they provide a workforce that has to travel all the way into Sydney, in many cases over an hour in a car to get there. We should be able to do better. And on that point too, the provision of proper public transport so people aren't feeling like they have to rely on a car is also important. I think, for example, the extension of the North West Metro from currently Tallawong Station to St Mary's, plus fixing roadways and opening up the M9, will not just mean that it's easier for residents to move around their neighbourhoods, it will also importantly open up economic activity, opportunity for new jobs in our part of the world and new industries. And increasingly too, as we're asking people to go on and take on university education that puts them into careers where they can do much better than their parents, and it's exactly what their parents wanted, as most of us who are parents will say, want our kids to do better than what we did. If the type of economic activity isn't present in our outer suburbs that ensures that people with those qualifications and training can be there, then what happens is the gravitational pull to go closer to the city occurs because they can't earn the same salaries. In my mobile offices, I've had people approach me and say, I have gone on, I've done my undergraduate degree, I've done my postdoc, they're getting huge investment in their own skills, but they don't have the job locally to do so. We need that talent to stay in our area to drive economic development. I think this is the big challenge longer term, that we get the infrastructure right and we see the type of firms come in and we see the way it changes the nature of neighbourhoods in our area, and also to deal with some of the chronic unemployment we've had. where if we get that right, some of the economic development that would occur would be close to areas where some of the highest and most persistent levels of unemployment have been. In suburbs, for example, around Shalvey, where we could easily access them to one of the biggest employment parks or employment estates it's actually the second biggest creator of jobs in Sydney at the moment, the Sydney Business Park out at Marsden Park. We could make that happen and connect people to jobs. And I think that is hugely important as well, because the type of work that's there, the manufacturing and capability we're encouraging through things like the National Reconstruction Fund, where we're thinking about areas where people can do make a big contribution. There are a lot of great manufacturing firms in Chifley that will benefit from that extra support. And talking this up and talking about the need for businesses to work together is huge. And the other thing I think longer term for our area is getting the planning right around the Marsden Park area, that CBD, and the Blacktown Council area, which is the biggest council in New South Wales. We'll open up a new CBD, and we can do it free of the colonial footprint that has dominated the design of so many cities in Western Sydney. So we do need to get that right. Infrastructure will be another thing that I will continue to advocate for our people in our part of Western Sydney, because I think it's not just about freeing people from traffic jams, it's about opening up opportunity and living a much better quality of life longer term. The other big thing for people in our area this year, and in this term but specifically this year, will be the decision we make around the voice. I'm proud, Deputy Speaker, to say that I represent one of the largest urban communities of Aboriginal Australians in the country, around 2770, the postcode, and there are terrific organisations in our area that are doing really important work. For them, they recognise the value and the importance of being recognised in our constitution and being able to have a say on things that affect them. And as I'm often being told, nothing about us without us is emphasised quite a bit. I think that is the right way to go. We represent people who want to be able to have a say on things that impact on them, and in terms of First Nations people, we should be able to get this right, and I think we can. And so it is something that I look forward to working with communities in our area to make sure that we do the right thing, that we do put in a positive decision, and that we do encourage a voice to emerge in our area. In concluding, I just wanted to reflect, as we all know, we get here not just with the support of people who vote for us, but there are a lot of people who devote a lot of their own time, and I'm very humbled and enormously appreciative of what is done by people to volunteer on my campaign or work with me as the member for Chifley. There were a lot of volunteers from my FEC, and in particular my FEC President Gail Barbagello, Geeth Garganaj as well as the Secretary, a lot of others who contributed, and there are so many that once you start, it becomes a bit tricky to list everyone there, but certainly within the FEC and the branches in my area, the people that helped out at my mobile offices, at the train stations that I visit, all the community events that I went to through the course of the term, even though we had disruption of COVID, it did mean a great deal, and I'm very grateful for their continued support in helping me do my job of trying to make sure that I'm able to hear firsthand from communities about the things that they think are important to them and they need me to lean into, and to be able to feed back to them what is going on and how we can work together to improve that. There was also a very close team, both in my electorate office and in my shadow ministerial team, that I just wanted to put on the record. Akano Amuda, Katie Booth, Kate Boyd, Brad Bunting, Amanda Feuerborn and Nicholas Petkovic. I just wanted to put on the record my gratitude for their contribution through the election campaign and through the course of the last term, and also Mel Ibrich, who was with me and then went to welcome her and her husband welcome their first child. And I just wanted to say to Mel, looking forward to her rejoining us at some point. Very, very good. Again, a lot of work that's been done there, to perform a job that has meant a great deal for me to be able to have the opportunity to represent people, as I said, Deputy Speaker, I care a great deal about, who deserve the support and the ability to do the things that they want to achieve in their life. I think Parliament, and in particular politics, can make a difference if it's done right, and I've been very grateful for the chance to yet again represent those communities as the member for Chifley.
Thank you, honourable member. I give the call to the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise with respect to this address and reply. I really want to talk about the needs that are in the Mayo community, and I think, you know, these are in many cases the needs that are reflected more broadly across regional Australia. The first one I want to talk about is health. Health, and in particular GPs and access to GPs, and then that elusive being able to see a GP and be bulk billed. Just yesterday, my daughter went to the doctor. She got sunburnt, and I told her off. In fact, I warned her beforehand. I said, the sun's really, really hot. Make sure that you absolutely cover yourself in sunscreen. But sometimes 18-year-olds don't use their ears as well as they should. Anyway, she got quite sunburnt, and she went to the doctor. Good thing to do. And a doctor saw her, and the nurse also saw her. And really, you know, it's amazing to be able to get a GP appointment, because in many parts of my electorate it takes weeks. However, the bill was $165. Now, my family can afford that. But she said, she's 18, she said, geez, I'm not going to do that again. And the thing is while she says that, there are a lot of people that will also be saying that and will go and use the emergency department simply because they can't afford that. Yes, you know, some of the money will come back, and I think the out-of-pocket is just over $50. But I do remember standing in this place and hearing many people who are now in government, when they were in opposition, saying the only thing you need to take to the doctor is your Medicare card. And what we are seeing is an erosion of bulk billing. I don't think there's anywhere in my electorate that bulk bills now. And I'm hearing this from pensioners too. I'm hearing this from people who are on all sorts of Centrelink payments, that they are not being bulk billed. And the problem is that the pressure is happening on emergency departments, or people are just not going at all. And then we're seeing worse health outcomes. Added to that, with respect to my doctors, and I don't begrudge the doctors. You know, some of my providers have closed. Others are saying that, you know, they're facing huge losses with the cost of actually running a practice. You know, one saying to me that they've lost, you know, $90,000, I think, in the year to date. That's their losses. So that's just not sustainable. We absolutely need to make this a priority. This is frontline health. This is really, you know, the gatekeeper to more expensive health treatments, and so this is the gatekeeper, and we absolutely need to fix this. Now, what we have seen though is that the issues around access to a GP, if you live in a regional area, have been made more difficult since the changes to where overseas doctors can practice. Now, it used to be that you needed to be in regional remote Australia in order for an overseas doctor. You needed to do a period of time over there. What we've seen, though, is that with changing of classification, you can effectively, in South Australia, be living in Unley and service down at Noarlunga now. You don't need to be in the regions. You can be living in North Adelaide and you can service Elizabeth. And so what we're seeing is many, and we had contracts cancelled in my electorate where you had overseas doctors who are not doing a stint in regional Australia. And this is making the health outcomes for people who live in regional Australia worse. And so I would urge the government to, you know, really put the magnifying glass on this, because if you are there to represent all of Australia, you will make sure that regional Australia has an equitable connection to the health system. I think, I'm pleased to see that there's a task force report that's happening and that there's money flagged in the budget, but I've got to say, this needs, every day that we have people who are not accessing a doctor because it is just too unaffordable to see a doctor is a day too long. Other urgent health priorities in my electorate include addressing the funding shortfall for the Southern Fleurieu Health Service Hospital upgrade at Victor Harbour to meet the projected needs of the growing community, which is the oldest community by median age in South Australia and one of the oldest in the nation. I think my median age across my South Coast community is over 60 years of age. So our health needs, are quite acute. Funding for the National Kidney Health Registry at Flinders Medical Centre to obtain better data and drive improved health outcomes and patient experiences. I was able to get chairs into the Mount Barker Hospital. So Mount Barker is a very large and fast-growing area, but it's hard to believe, when I was first elected, that we did not have any dialysis chairs at all in this region, and so people were travelling down to the city to have dialysis. I surveyed all the GPs in my electorate and I said, how great is the need? And they told me about patients that they had who had said, it's just too difficult to do this drive, the tyranny of the distance. And so they elected to stop having dialysis and subsequently passed away. We're now at a point in Mount Barker where there's a wait list. And we need to make sure that we get dialysis into the regions and keep that up, make sure that we are addressing the demand. This is a huge issue. I'd also like to address another issue that's come to mind that sits in the health spectrum, is the age discriminatory rules under Medicare, that if a person needs to have an MRI on their knee, if they're over 50 years of age, a GP referral is not enough for it to be Medicare rebated. They have to go to a specialist. It's this sort of ingrained discrimination against older Australians that needs to stop. We are putting barriers up from people accessing healthcare. Now, if you're 49, GP referral, Medicare rebated, not a problem. 51, different story. And I just think these sort of arbitrary discriminatory lines that we place are particularly unhelpful. And again, I've talked to many people in my community who cannot afford to get that MRI because they can't afford the gap. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to talk about sport and recreation. I think sport is very much the glue that holds our communities together. Now, not everybody's playing sport, but many people around the periphery are spectators, are volunteers, are joining for the social interaction. I know many older people in my community, their Saturday afternoon of going and watching the local football. I love it because many of them sit in the cars and then they get out. It's normally freezing cold, and then they go and get themselves a drink and a meat pie, and then go and spend some time in the stands. But what we've seen is that the whole sports rot saga, which was incredibly disappointing because we actually had an infrastructure round that could have put money into where there was enormous need across Australia in our sporting infrastructure. That was poorly managed by I think everyone's standards, and it was rorted. But what we haven't seen is future rounds, and that's a real shame. Because when I look at so much of the infrastructure for sport in my community, the infrastructure that we have was built in the 50s. It was built by volunteers in the 50s, had a bit of renovation in the 80s or 90s, but it's no longer fit for purpose. We don't have, in many of our places, we don't have mobility accessible bathrooms. A lot of our footy clubs certainly don't, we've got lots of girls' teams. We don't have anywhere for the girls to get changed. and I don't know, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you've spent much time in a locker room in a footy club, but it's got a certain aroma and a certain, you could say, ambience to it. It's perhaps not really conducive for women who also want to feel included in that scenario. We need to spend money on this. You know, we recognise that sport assists our community so broadly from health and mental health, and yet we don't put the resources behind that ageing infrastructure. So just to name a few places, you know, Strathalbyn Districts Basketball Association has outgrown its existing single court, one court in a great big shed, and training is held off-site. New players are being turned away, and that could be, you know, just the one thing that makes a young person feel so disconnected from their community. We are seeing regional competitions. We're not able to participate in those. We're not able to hold those because we just don't have the facilities. We desperately need, just for Strathalbyn, $8 million to develop a 3-court venue. That's not a huge ask, and yet we don't have any grant rounds that we can put forward for that. Wollonga netball clubs, you know, players are playing on ageing courts. They're injuring themselves. And so just $1 million will help redevelop those courts. Probably one that just really stands out to me is the Strathalbyn Strikers Soccer Club. They have 2 portaloos, you know, the kind of portaloos you see on a building site. That's what they have for all of their kids. Now, this is a fastest growing take-up sport in my community. They have so many kids playing. They don't even have sinks in these. Players have nowhere to change. We really need to do better. Many areas are experiencing huge growth. You know, the Aldinga region, we've just seen the state government announce that they're going to build more homes up to Sellex, and yet that whole area does not have any sort of aquatic facility. And when we're talking about aquatic facilities, we're talking about hydrotherapy. So again, there's that link into health. Going back to the Strathalbyn Strikers, I mean, we're not talking about a little club here with 2 portaloos. We're talking about 200 players, and they're keen to host, and they do host championships. And every time they hold those championships, they inject a couple of $1,000s into the region where people stop, and they stop at the local bakery, and they stop and buy some food, and they get their petrol. These facilities really do not match the standards that are expected. And, you know, I'm always so aghast when I drive through the metropolitan area and I see their flashy facilities. Extraordinary. They're beautiful, and we're dealing with portaloos. I also would like to talk about the need for infrastructure in the regions, and particularly in my electorate. Now, the roads in the Adelaide Hills in Mayo are overrepresented in South Australia's crash statistics. And sadly, I read in the newspaper this morning that we lost another young person on our roads overnight. And that family will never be the same. 4% of the state's population reside in the hills, yet we are 5% of fatalities and 7% of serious injury crashes on our roads. I really do ask the government, and in South Australia we don't have a very large part of the federal road network, and so we are underfunded when it comes to talking about the funds that come in from the federal government towards our road network. And I ask the government for $80 million to urgently address the black spot areas and road widening corridors, improving. You know, these are just basic things that we need: sealing shoulders, modifying embankments, removing road hazards, rehabilitating pavement and improved signage. And another significant infrastructure spend that we need is a new heavy rail corridor for our hills. We've been talking about this for ages. We really need to get the freight network out of the hills, and that will give us a corridor for some public transport. It's hard to believe that a community that will be over 50,000, that's just in the Mount Barker area, not looking at the broader area across the hills, has no rail. We used to have rail until the mid-80s when they decided that it was no longer necessary, has no tram network. And we talk in here about climate change and we talk in here about pollution, and yet we're not putting in the infrastructure to allow people to change how they live their lives. And we desperately need to have some train network, again, some sort of rail network. On a positive note, though, I do live in the most beautiful electorate in Australia, and we have been voted the happiest electorate in Australia, and I think we still hold that title, and part of it is our beautiful scenery. We do have a number of bike trails, but what we need to do is connect it all together with the Adelaide Wine Capital Cycle Trail, and that will be essentially a cycling pilgrimage across 250 kilometres. Now, they have this in France. This is a huge part of their tourism right across France. You can essentially cycle from one point of France to the other, entirely off-road, up and down through all of the different regions. It's connected with the tourism there, so your bags get taken from one hotel to the other. It sounds very civilised, but we really need to have those visitors to the Adelaide Hills, down to the Fleurieu and across to Kangaroo Island too. I should really say up from the Barossa. No longer have the Barossa in my electorate, but I think that that's what visitors expect. They want to see an experience, and we need to put that investment in. Further afield, if I look at Kangaroo Island, we regularly have 220,000 visitors per annum into Kangaroo Island, but it's an area of we have just over 5,600 rateable properties. A number of those are absent ratepayers, but they're servicing a $400 million road network asset. It puts enormous pressure on the whole of the Kangaroo Island community, which just was voted one of the best, I think it was the best beach in Australia with Stokes Bay. We can't, on one hand, champion these locations and say how wonderful they are, and then not back it in with the resources and the funding that's needed. And one other infrastructure piece that needs to be done is the Victor Harbour Road. And not just the Victor Harbour Road, I might say, also the Mount Compass to Goolwa Road. These roads, sadly, are overrepresented with respect to crashes. They are incredibly busy roads, and I urge the government to invest here. This is really about... and another area of my electorate that has very limited public transport. I think really essentially one bus a day will go up to the city, well, a couple of buses a day. Many people call for the rail all the way down to Victor. We need to make sure that we have accessible transport, particularly if they're also very fast-growing regions, as Victor Harbour is. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to close by talking about the Stronger Communities program. I was really pleased to see the Stronger Communities program is currently open at the moment, and all of us are taking submissions for that. This program has been around, well, certainly all the years that I've been a Member of Parliament, and it's a program that our whole community really looks forward to. One year, I think I had about $1.5 million worth of applications for just $150,000. Now, what you could do with $150,000 in your community back in 2016 was very different to what you can do with that now. And so I would urge the government to perhaps look at increasing that, because you get enormous bang for buck with that program, a huge amount of buy-in and in-kind support from our communities, and really good grassroots projects. There's no money wasted when the money goes directly from the federal government to the community group. It doesn't kind of waffle through some kind of state and local government puzzle where money somehow seems to get lost. So I would really encourage the government to look at this program again with fresh eyes, perhaps enlarge the program, and also we need to make sure that we can also have those other great programs we've had in the past with respect to our school communities. That was another good one, very similar to this. Why don't we, in the year where many of our soldiers' memorial halls are turning a century, why not have, which is particularly important in the regions, why not have a further program to make sure that those beautiful 100-year-old buildings have a life for the next 100 years? Thank you.
I thank the honourable member. I give the call to the Minister and Member for Scullin.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. In making my contribution to the address and reply, I want to start by thanking the voters of the Scullin electorate for putting their trust in me for the fourth time. It's a very humbling privilege, and I thank those who did support me, but I acknowledge that many did not. Indeed, more at the last election than at the election before it. And that's something that I have been reflecting on, and I commit myself here, as I go about my work as the member for Scullin, to earn the trust, if not always the support, of all the people I have the privilege of representing. I think this is an important point right now at this juncture in democratic politics, where we know that trust in politics and political institutions is much lower than it has been, much lower than it should be, much lower than it needs to be. I am very conscious that for all of us who come to this place, we bring our values, our sense of how the world should be, our sense of the role of government. But for us to be able to play out these debates about how our politics should be, this must rest on an understanding and appreciation across the community that the work we do in this place matters, that it can improve the lives of our constituents and people around the country. I think rebuilding a sense of trust and confidence in this institution, this parliament, is absolutely vital. And I hope that over the course of this term in parliament, I can do more to engage with the full diversity of the people who I represent in the Scullin electorate, and also make a contribution as I go about my work in this place. And I acknowledge the Shadow Minister who's just come into the Federation Chamber, to see if we can do better at not always striving for bipartisanship. I think that's a false hope, but working out how we can play out our differences in a more respectful manner, recognising that there are many issues upon which people will disagree by reason of their background, their worldview, but I think we need to find a way to better engage all of our communities in a sense that what happens in this place is, as I strongly believe is the case, the work of a diverse group of people of goodwill who come to this place with a firm desire to do the best for their communities and to see the best done for the country. We haven't always conducted ourselves, and I include myself in this criticism, in a way that builds that trust and confidence upon which a strong democracy should rest. And I will do my best, and again I know that the Shadow Minister will hold me to account in this respect, as in other respects, as he should, to see if I can make a contribution to raising the standard of political debate and dealing with, I think, the greatest threat to our democracy, which is an increasing sense of cynicism towards what we do and alienation from politics and political institutions more broadly. And I do think in making these reflections that we can't divorce this sense of grievance and cynicism from how the experience of the pandemic affected so many in our communities. That's something that I have reflected on, as I've also reflected on the particular challenges of being a representative through that difficult time. And I do want to acknowledge the former Speaker of the House, Tony Smith, and the former President of the Senate for the work that they did in ensuring that our parliament continued to function, and I believe functioned well through a period of great disruption. I think it was important that our constituents saw us continuing our representative work through that period, and some very important work was done. I want to acknowledge also during that time and indeed always the work of the group of people I'm very fortunate to have worked with in my electorate office. To Laurie, to Sally, to Nick, to Alice, to Zoe, to Eric and to Ola, and also to Jim Tilkarides, who has recently retired. And I want to put on record in this place Jim's extraordinary record of service, working with me and serving the community, including as Mayor of the City of Whittlesea. He's a dear friend, a source of wise counsel, and someone who has made an extraordinary contribution, a contribution that continues, I add. But the work of all of our electorate officers was incredibly important through the challenges of the pandemic. In those early stages when so many people sought to engage with Centrelink, often for the first time in their lives, where in a country like ours, a majority migrant nation, where the closure of the borders had such an extraordinary impact and with people trapped. And I was so proud of the work of my team in working to get people connected to relatives stuck overseas, making such a difference to so many, as well as the work that they did more broadly. And I think all of us in this place know that we are nothing but for the people who we have the privilege of working with. And I think during the period of the pandemic that was particularly so. And I'm so pleased at the work that the team I work with did during that time, and that work continues, some in new roles. And I want to acknowledge the contributions in my team right now from Sam, from Hamish, from Khadija and from Maureen, who have joined us in the electorate office. And the electorate office Deputy Speaker of the Minister for Immigration has some unusual pressures applied to it from time to time, both on the phone and occasionally on the street out the front. And again, I want to acknowledge that that my staff, and indeed the staff of all of us as members of Parliament, often have to put up with a lot by reason of our actions or our inactions, and I'm very conscious of some of the pressures that's put on them as they go about doing really extraordinary work supporting the communities that make up the Scullin electorate. And I think about right now where the devastation in Turkey and Syria particularly affects thousands of people who I represent. And I want to recognise in this place the pressures and the stresses that I'm seeing in the community. And I do look forward to engaging more directly on these things when I'm back in Melbourne next week. I want to also touch on in these remarks the election itself, the last election, and I have already thanked the people of Scullin for their continuing support and acknowledged those who did not support me. But there are a couple of dynamics at that election that I saw again in the recent Victorian state election that I did find concerning, and I made some remarks earlier about my concern to see our disagreements, our disputes in this place play out in a different manner, because I do see a change in the tenor of politics on the ground, and I was particularly concerned to see that in the recent state election, where I saw some very disturbing behaviours, particularly at early voting centres, particularly directed at female members of Parliament and candidates. Across the political spectrum, I think we are seeing some concerning signs in our political life, and we really do need to create political conversations in the community as well as in this place that are respectful and fundamentally that are safe. We need to remove any sense of apprehension or disincentive that might deny people from thinking about taking on a role in public life. And I am concerned that the tenor of our debate and some of the behaviours we have seen do have that chilling effect on an important aspect of our democracy, and that is something that I would like to see reflected as we all go about our work. I was very pleased as I went through that election campaign, which now of course seems quite some time ago, Deputy Speaker, to see a number of significant commitments made in opposition that will be delivered as part of the work of the Albanese Labor government. And I want to touch on just two in particular. One is the funding commitment to the Peter Hopper Lake in Mill Park, a really significant investment in a beautiful part of the electorate that needed help, that a place that had been such a focus for community members that had been so degraded. and I'm really looking forward to working with the community and the council to see this beautiful lake be restored to its pristine state so that it can be enjoyed by early morning walkers and by families enjoying the playground and the off-leash dog park next door. I'm also really pleased that something that I've been fighting for a long time moves a step closer with the commitment of funding for a feasibility study for rail or public transport out to Wollert. The growing communities on the northwestern side of the Scullin electorate going into the McEwen electorate are vibrant and diverse places, but access to the amenity that many Melburnians appreciate, as well as access to work, particularly in the CBD, is being held back by the lack of public transport opportunities there. And we do see everywhere in suburban communities the cost of congestion on people's lives, and it is important that everyone has the ability to access everything that is good in Melbourne, the ability to access a wider range of employment opportunities, as well as all the other great things that make Melbourne undoubtedly the greatest city in our country. So I'm very pleased to see that commitment. I look forward to ensuring that, along with very significant road investments, we're going to make it easier for people to get around the northern suburbs, but also to get around our city more broadly, particularly with expanding public transport access. I see the enormous difference on the other side of my electorate that the extension of the train line to Mernda has made, and to see that play out on the other side, particularly as the Epping precinct expands with the developments around the hospital, is something that I really want to work towards making a reality soon. At a broader level, I'm conscious that there is much work to do, particularly on addressing two big issues. The cost of living that's impacting on everyone is a critical challenge for all of us in this place. And you know, the first act of this government was, of course, to support an increase in the minimum wage. There is more to be done in that regard, and it will be a relentless focus for me as a local member, as well as for a member of the government, to work with our economic team and indeed Minister Burke in his industrial relations responsibilities to see more done in this regard. The other critical question, and it's a common one, is access to primary health care, and that's something that I'll continue to work with the community and indeed with our excellent health team to work towards. I was very privileged to have been given the opportunity by the Prime Minister to serve as the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs shortly after the election. It's an extraordinary honour to have these responsibilities which impact the lives really of every Australian, and give me an opportunity to play a part in shaping not just our recovery from the pandemic and that period of border closure, but to play a significant role in thinking about the nation that we are and the nation that we might be. In terms of multicultural affairs, I am extraordinarily proud of the achievements that we have made and recognise the bipartisan commitment to multiculturalism that has played such a role in boosting social cohesion and making this country, this modern nation, so great, with our unique blend of the world's oldest continuing cultures and people bringing their culture, sharing their culture from all around the world. But when I say this, I am not, and I will not overlook the barriers that many Australians face by reason of their background, and that discrimination still occurs and holds individuals back and holds us all back by denying people the opportunity to fulfil their potential. Ending these barriers is a critical part of my role, and I believe a critical responsibility of national government. I think a vision of our country as a place where everyone belongs in every place, where we see people represented in proportion in all the places that matter, including in this place, is an important part of realising our potential as a country. So I think recognising that there are still barriers that hold back too many Australians from fulfilling their potential as being something that morally we need to attend to, as an equal society, as an egalitarian society, but also taking that next step to recognise that this denial of individual quality and capacity is not just a problem for them, it's a problem for all of us. So I do want to recognise that. I do want to speak very briefly to one of the critical questions that this government has put before the Australian people, and that is my commitment to all aspects of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and in particular my strong support for constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament. This is something that matters to many in the community I represent, and I will be working with them to secure a strong support for this generous gesture that First Nations people have made, and to remind people that whilst the Albanese government is resolute in our support for the voice, this is not an idea of the Albanese government. This is the product of a process engaging so many First Nations people for so long. And that is a point which often gets lost in what passes for the debate here, but something that I'm very conscious of. What we are doing in asking Australians to support the voice is simply to say yes to an offer extended to non-Indigenous Australians by First Nations people. It's a simple, generous request, and it's a request that we must answer in the affirmative if we are to fulfil our potential as a nation. I stand here in this Parliament because of the support of the voters of the Scowen electorate, but of course I only stand here because many worked hard to make Labor's victory in Scowen a reality. And I want to acknowledge some of those people who made a real contribution to my campaign and to acknowledge the debt I owe to each of them. I think about Helen Said, I think about Paul Bruce and Carla Seidel, Rana Jarvid, Jim Kerrin and everyone from the men's shed at Layla, Tom Watkins, David Canavo, Chris Pavlidis, who's given so much to community for so long, as has my friend Suchet Nunal and all of his family, to Connie Boglis, to Brian and Ellen Smitty, to Jim Bannon, Vince O'Grady, Anthony Mancuso, Samil Demir, Sonne Delican, to Ray Rosales, to Nessie Sayer, to Judy Snell, to Nora Rocker, to Yogi Thruanatram, to Yami Elrasi, to Pam McLeod, to Maureen Corrigan, to Joe Caruso, to Stephanie Santos, Sam Alessi, again a giant of the community, Regina Huning, a person who's done so much and has been going through very difficult challenges in her family. I'm thinking about her and Emily as I stand here now. Eugenia Pavlopoulou, John Fry and Joe Petrucci. I stand here because of all your work and your support, and I'm always grateful for both. I recognise that as well as the fantastic team in the electorate, and just so it's on the record, I'll go through Laurie, Sally, Nick, Alice, Zoe, Eric, Ola and Sasha, who worked for me in the last term, and to Lachlan, who also worked with me in my portfolio responsibilities. I said a few minutes ago that I was proud and I feel privileged to be Australia's Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, and I am pleased at the role that I've been able to play with all of my colleagues in making a difference for the lives of Australians who rely on a migration system that works in our national interest and in the interests of every Australian. I'm pleased that we've been able to get the visa backlog down. I'm thrilled that more staff are engaged, more than 485 in visa processing roles since May of last year. I'm pleased that we have managed to process and finalise more than 4.7 million visa applications, and that we've been able to prioritise skilled visas in critical sectors like health and education to fill those critical shortages that have been impacting the lives of too many Australians. As someone who's long been concerned about people seeking asylum, I note now that we've filled almost 9,000 visas as part of the humanitarian program, and in particular more than 4,250 permanent humanitarian visas have been granted to Afghan citizens in this program year, as well as more than 1,300 family visas. There is of course more to be done supporting them, and I think we all acknowledge in this place our particular moral obligation to the people of Afghanistan. There's work that's being done, and I acknowledge the former government for their support for Ukrainians who have sought our protection as well. I'm pleased that we're seeing the first arrivals through the community sponsorship pilot, again, an initiative begun by the former government, but one that I believe we can make a big feature of our migration program as we harness the generosity that's found in communities right across Australia. I'm thrilled that we're bringing the citizenship backlog down, and I can't say how pleased I am that the circumstances of people who've been in this country for a decade, who've been found to be owed our protection, can now move beyond simply existing to living and making the choices that each of us take for granted. Yeah. That decision announced Monday was one of the proudest days of my life, and I'm pleased that I have the opportunity to continue to build on this body of work.
I thank the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. The question is that the address be agreed to, and I give the call to the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, the member for Wannon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And I just want to put some context on this debate for all those who are listening. The Governor-General's opening speech to the Parliament is basically the Governor-General delivering a message from the Prime Minister, from the government, about what its priorities are for the coming term of government. And it's an important speech in outlining what the government hopes to achieve. And I'd like to refer to the Governor-General's speech just to get a sense of where we're at. We're not quite 12 months since the last election, but we're already starting to see some trends, some developments to where the government has got some things right and to where the government has gone completely off track and is getting a lot of things wrong. And my deep, deep concern is that if it continues down the track that it is, that things are going to get a lot worse, sadly, for Australians rather than a lot better. Now, in the opening of the Governor-General's speech, he referred to the government knows this country faces serious and pressing challenges. And the first one that was mentioned was the rising cost of living. Now, what you would have hoped for was that, having identified this as the number one priority, the government would have been doing everything it can to make sure that it was putting downward pressure on these rising costs of living. Yet, sadly, we're seeing the exact opposite. If you look at interest rates, the Reserve Bank has met 8 times since May, since the change of government, and 8 times it has raised interest rates. Now, the sad reality is that interest rates are always higher under a Labor government, and the facts prove that. And we have the facts, and we can demonstrate the facts, that under Labor, interest rates are always higher. And it's a very simple reason why. Labor spend more, you pay more. Labor spend more, you pay more. If governments don't spend wisely, spend productively, spend in a way that is in the interests of the nation for the longer term, then it puts upward pressure on interest rates. And that is sadly what we are seeing. We know you will always pay more under Labor, and the sad reality is interest rates as a result will always be higher under Labor, and that's because Labor like to spend more. And it's worth remembering, the more they spend, the more you pay. So that is one of the big areas of concern already that we're seeing from the government and the way the government is going about things. That was the first thing that was identified in the Governor-General's reply speech, rising costs of living. And when it comes to interest rates, sadly, we're not heading in the right direction. The other thing that is really impacting on people's cost of living is energy bills. And once again, we're seeing rather poor action from the government, which is actually making the situation worse rather than the situation better. And I'm going to go to a proof point, and this is a proof point that I raised in the Parliament in question time, in a question to the Prime Minister himself. And I raised the example of a constituent of mine. This constituent is Alan Dennett. He lives at home. He's 80 years of age with his wife and their disabled son. And they received in the mail their latest energy bill. And in it, it said that your gas bill will increase by approximately $1,300 over the next 12 months. Now, for Mr Dennett, this is an enormous increase in his gas bill for him and his family. And what the Prime Minister needs to explain to Mr Dennett and to many other people right across the nation is why he told him and others that their power bill would go down by $275. Now, he said this before the election. Your power bill will go down by $275. He said it on 97 occasions. Now, one of the things that we have been trying to do is to get the Prime Minister to even mention $275 since the election. He was quite happy to before the election, 97 occasions he mentioned $275. After the election, he hasn't mentioned it once. Now, this is not being upfront with the Australian people. This is hiding from the Australian people. If you cannot honour that commitment, Prime Minister, then you should come clean with the Australian people and tell them. You talk about reasons and excuses as to why now you can't deliver that, but why won't you come out and just say, on 97 occasions before the last election, I mentioned that your power bill would go down by $275. I was wrong. I was wrong. I can't deliver that. I shouldn't have said it. I was wrong. Now, that would be, I think, something the Australian people would appreciate. They would. They would say, OK, you're being upfront with us. Instead, you're just tricky, playing games, won't come clean, just saying, oh, it's this and that and this and that and that's why, but you won't actually come out and say $275, we said it 97 times before the last election. We might have been just, gilding the lily a bit. We can't deliver on that. We've got it wrong. As a matter of fact, what's happening is the complete opposite. And in Mr Dennett's case, it's not a $275 reduction. For his family, it's a nearly $1,400 increase. And I can understand why there is growing concern, not only in my communities, but right across the nation, which is with what is happening with energy. Because one thing was said before the election and we're seeing something completely opposite when it comes to after the election. And it's not just when it comes to interest rates, it's not just when it comes to electricity bills. We're also seeing it when families go to the supermarket to shop. The increase in what they're paying at the checkout just continues to rise. And the sad reality is I think most Australians now are just wondering, well, what is the government's plan to deal with inflation? What is the government's plan to deal with these cost increases? Now, the government said before the election that it was going to address real wages. They said that they were going to make sure that real wages continued to increase. Now, the sad reality is that real wages are going backwards, and they continue to go backwards since the May election. And this is another area where, rather than being tricky and saying that wages are increasing, the government needs to come clean and say real wages, i.e. wages adjusted for inflation, are going backwards. At least then the Australian people would know the reality of what they're facing. They're facing rising cost of living pressures when it comes to interest rates, when it comes to energy bills, when it comes to what they're paying at the supermarket, and the government isn't able to address it. The government doesn't have a plan to address it. If the government came clean on that, I think the Australian people would at least be saying the government's been upfront with them. But we're not seeing that. And it's not just your energy bills, it's not just interest rates, it's just not what you're paying at the supermarket, it's also what's happening with regards to insurance, and it's also with what's happening with regards to rents. They're also all going up. So the sad reality is, right across the board, people are paying more. And that's why, sadly, the fact of the matter is that you'll always pay more under Labor. And it's worth noting, and I think the Australian people are starting to understand this. Labor spend more and you pay more. So you've got to remember, when they're out there promising the world and spending more, what they're really doing is making sure that you will pay more. Now, the second thing that was mentioned as a sort of key priority in the Governor-General's opening speech was that there would be fixed low wages growth. Now, as I've mentioned before, what's actually happened when it comes to real wages, your wages adjusted for CPI, for inflation, is they're actually going backwards. So the government hasn't been able to address this, and the facts demonstrate it. And that is why Australians are feeling poorer. And the sad reality is when you speak to many people in my communities and right across Australia, when you say to them, are you feeling better off than how you were in May last year, most of them are saying, no, I'm not. I'm feeling poorer. Now, the third thing that they said they would be addressing is climate change. Now, what we've seen is the government building on the track record of the coalition, but building on the track record of the coalition in only one regard. We were able to bring emissions down but keep energy prices low. What we're seeing from the government is they are following our lead in reducing emissions, but sadly not doing it by keeping energy low. And that is the thing that they have to get right, because if they can't get that right, sure, emissions are going to continue to go down. But what we're going to see is either our major manufacturers move offshore as a result, or those manufacturers will actually shut down. And that is in no one's interest. So the real test for the government when it comes to climate change is to be able to reduce emissions, but ensure that all our key industries can remain open and continue to be able to thrive. And that is particularly important for those that are energy intensive and exposed to overseas competition. Because if you don't get that right, all that you will lead to is that our productive manufacturers will either move overseas, or the competition from overseas will be so strong that they will be forced to shut. And that is in no one's interest. Now, dealing with the tensions in our region and the uncertainty in our world. And in this area, I must say, I think the government has done better than it has anywhere else. And that's because they've followed in a bipartisan way the approach that the previous government has taken. And that has been to understand the uncertainty of the times that we are dealing with and to make sure that we continue to address them. So under our government, we made sure that defence spending increased and continued to increase, and that we made sure that we were going to have the ability to be able to defend ourselves and defend ourselves strongly. And the government is building on that approach. When it comes to foreign policy, the government has continued our priority to make sure we're continuing that engagement with the region and that critical engagement in the Pacific, and also that we continue to build and support those key alliances that we have, in particular with the US and the UK. And we're about to see how important AUKUS will be to our future over the coming months, because all the work that was done by the previous government in putting AUKUS together, and former Prime Minister Scott Morrison deserves huge credit here, is about to bear fruit. And we're about to hear all about that over the coming months. The only thing that I would point to where I think the government could have done a better job is actually in the trade portfolio. We're still waiting for the UK Free Trade Agreement to come into force. That has taken far too long and shows that the government hasn't been active enough in making sure that that passes through the UK Parliament and would be into force. And also, they've sat on their heels a bit when it's come to the free trade agreement with India. Obviously, we have that in force now. It was an incredibly important bit of work, but why we haven't had a massive trade delegation already in India, making sure we're building on that, I think is one area where the government has left a little bit has been left a little bit wanting. The other thing which is mentioned in this reply speech, and I see I'm going to run out of time, which is a great shame because there's a lot more I could go through, is around the area of infrastructure. Now, the sad reality is that in this speech, the government hasn't identified anything when it comes to the regions and in particular infrastructure. And what we've seen instead is once again Labor being true to form and completely ignoring our regions. Now, I had to raise in Parliament this week after a constituent who I called told me about his ambulance ride from Portland to Hamilton along the Henty Highway. He had broken ribs, a punctured lung, and along the road he had to be sedated because it was such a rough ambulance ride. Now, the sad thing is that the government in its October budget cut $40 million from that road and the Princess Highway in an act of political, and I would use the word, but I won't because it's unparliamentary, but it starts with B, the like of which I haven't seen. The like of which I haven't seen. Cutting $40 million from our roads when I have asked the Prime Minister and the Premier of Victoria to come down and drive on them to see how poor they are, because if they drove on them, there would be no reason, they would have no excuse to have done what they've done, cutting that $40 million. And I will hold them to account for that. And I know every state MP in my local area will also be making sure that the government is held to account for ripping that $40 million out of our road funding. We also, Deputy Speaker, have seen that projects like the Warrnambool Surf Lifesaving Club, our local roads package, which was extensive, won't be funded. The upgrade to the Eliminite Recreation Reserve, to the Port Fairy Community Sports Hub won't be upgraded. And as a matter of fact, very important things like the Portland Community Sporting Complex won't be upgraded. As a matter of fact, all we've seen is the government taking money from our regional projects, important local community projects, and putting nothing towards them. And if I have one message out of this speech today, it is to the Albanese government, and that is, please you always do it, but make this government a little different. Actually get in behind and support regional communities to grow and develop. Don't just look after the inner city. Make sure that you also understand that Australia exists outside of our capital cities, because that is the biggest flaw that we always see from Labor governments, is that they do not understand how important regional and rural Australia is, and investing in regional and rural Australia is. Deputy Speaker, in concluding, can I thank all my staff, my hard-working staff, both when I was previously a minister and now, for the wonderful work they do for me, and I have one of those wonderful staff members in here with me today. Can I thank all those supporters who helped me throughout the last election campaign. We had over 800 volunteers help and support my re-election in Wannon. To all of you, and I said it in the lunch we did afterwards, a very, very big thank you. We have to hold this government to account, and that is what I will be doing.
And I thank the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship. The question is that the address be agreed to, and I give the call to the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services.
Thanks so much, Deputy Speaker. It's a great honour to be a Member of Parliament, and each and every one of us. The things that we ranker over, the things that we disagree on, the policy challenges, the performance, the thing that we all hold in common is that it's an enormous honour to be elected to represent our communities in this place. It's an important institution. It should be treated with care and respect, as our democracy is an important institution, young by international standards, and something that needs to be nurtured and respected. In the 2022 election, Labor promised a better future for the people of Australia, including those of my electorate in Whitlam, and we're delivering on that promise. For the members here, my electorate runs from the coast, the industrial heartlands of the coastland, the big suburbs of Dapto, of Albion Park, Shell Harbour, once a village, now a major city, the coastal strip between Windang in the north and the famous farm, Killalea Beach in the south, right up to the Hume Highway in the Southern Highlands, in many respects two separate electorates, very different, a regional electorate, farming villages of Robertson, service towns like Moss Vale, once farming villages, now tourist regions like Berrima, and the very popular tourist destination of Bowral and Mittagong. Great place to represent, wonderful honour. We promised a better future. It's my great challenge in this place to represent them all. It's a great honour to be a minister in this government, and it's a great challenge to fulfil my ministerial responsibilities while ensuring that my first and foremost responsibility, representing the locals of my electorate, is fulfilled as well. We understand the economic challenges. There are many, and we're facing into them. We received a budget in all sorts of mess, $1 trillion worth of debt, a structural deficit which will take considerable effort to wind back. We received an economy with significant supply-side constraints, living in the shadow of the COVID pandemic and all the changes, significant changes that need to be made. Inflationary pressures in the economy, many of them received because of energy price increases received internationally, gas and coal and petrol, influenced by international factors, but as the Treasurer often says, received internationally but felt around household kitchen tables. Significant structural problems with the budget. It's not the job of government to complain about the situation we received. It is our job to explain it and to explain to the Australian people what we're going to do about it. We've already taken real action on climate change, legislating our targets, now working with the Parliament to ensure that our new safeguard mechanisms are able to move through the parliament so that we can do the heavy lifting on meeting that 2030 and 2035 as well as our 2050 emissions reduction target. We've legislated for cheaper childcare, knowing that for many households that's a very large and lumpy expense in their weekly budget. We've legislated changes to our workplace relations system, which will get work wages moving again, but also making a concrete difference in areas that I think all members of this place share. For example, in the area of domestic violence, paid domestic violence leave, of course, the angels in all of our nature hope that nobody ever has to access it, but we know in reality that it is a scourge on our society, people having to take time out of work to attend to moving home, getting care, getting support. Our domestic violence leave will make a concrete difference in that area. We intend to have a conversation and a referendum on a voice to Parliament to lift up our democracy, to lift up our founding document, to ensure that it reflects the 65,000 years of First Nations heritage. We have introduced and legislated in this matter, I know you're very engaged with, Mr Deputy Speaker, a National Anti-Corruption Commission. Corruption doesn't stop, and the threat of corruption doesn't stop at a state border. It was naive of this place to think that we are immune from the threats of corruption in public life and public administration. A National Anti-Corruption Commission sends a strong signal to those of us involved in public life and those involved in public administration that there is a watchdog which will be seriously addressed. The mere fact that we have one hopefully provides a very persuasive influence along the way that elected and public officials conduct themselves. In the area of energy, we know it's a challenge, a big challenge. I've mentioned that most of the problems in the energy market have been received to us by either failed energy policies of our predecessors, failure to take the shift to renewal seriously, together with the war in Ukraine. But again, complaining about the problem is not the role of government. Explaining what's going on and putting in place solutions are. Our wholesale energy price caps in the area of coal and gas, legislated, regrettably not supported by the other side. The coalition parties voted against capping prices, which were advised by Treasury modelling in the last 24 hours is already having a material impact on the prices that people will pay at the household and business level. That's what a serious government does, just getting on with the business, trying to put practical solutions in place. Closer to my home in the Illawarra and Southern Highlands, I made a promise to my constituents that I'd continue to advocate for them. With the Labor government in office, they know their voices are going to be heard, and we'll deliver on the promises that we made nationally to every Australian, but also locally. At home, this includes funding for a $25 million trauma recovery centre for families, women and children who unfortunately have had to endure family and domestic violence. First in the country, will be a pilot and lead the way for other such initiatives around the country. Delivering community batteries, again, firming up our energy generation and distribution system, but also a pilot for the way we might provide energy storage solutions for communities. The beauty of community batteries is that it provides the benefits of renewable energy generation, for example, solar installation. For those communities, maybe they're not homeowners, maybe they live in units, maybe they're renters, and aren't going to install solar on a house that they don't own, but they get the benefit of that through the installation of community batteries. Going into Dapto, very pleased to be a part of a national pilot in that respect. $9 million provided to Wollongong Council to build an accessible sport and play precinct at West Dapto. When I was first elected, West Dapto was mostly farms, dairy farms. It's now burgeoning suburbs. They're underserviced in relation to a lot of community infrastructure. new sporting facilities will make a material difference to this growing community. Hoping to get work underway over the next couple of years. The $9 million will facilitate that. Over $500,000 to the Southern Highlands Botanic Gardens to create a dedicated learning facility. This is a volunteer-run organisation. When I was first elected, it was a patch of dirt on the outskirts of Bowral. It's now a burgeoning community facility, entirely community-run, Botanic Gardens, and they're lifting it up every year. This money will help them put in place an education facility. $450,000 to the Southern Highlands Regional Art Gallery, Nunangoula. Again, another magnificent community facility for the installation of solar systems to help them power the gallery. What's the solar system got to do with art? Well, it will save them thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a year in operation costs, which they can then reconvert that money into staff, community programs, and bringing more exhibitions into the area. Absolutely fantastic. And I want to pay tribute to Ben Quilty and the team that have been driving the establishment of that gallery and ensuring that it's going to bring art to the Southern Highlands and ensure that they can enjoy in that fantastic community-run facility. Deputy Speaker, I was first elected in 2010, the same year as you. I'm delighted to say that this is my 5th election. I couldn't have been elected at the first, second, third or fourth or even 5th time unless it had been with the amazing support of a team of volunteers. The first lot of volunteers are your family, of course. They're conscripted. And I want to thank my partner, Brooke. I want to thank my kids and my extended family, my kids Jessica and Paddy, and my extended family for the enormous support that they give to me so that I can do my job here. I want to thank the branches and the branch members who've, year in, year out, and during the dark days, the tough times, we were in opposition for 9 years, really tough times for many of branches, many of whom have been members of our great party since before I was born. I want to pay tribute to them. The Albion Park Oak Flats branch, the Dapto branch, the Port Kembla branch, Shell Harbour and Barrack Height branch, Southern Highlands branch, and the magnificent Warilla and Mount Warrigal branch. I'm now going to do something very risky, Deputy Speaker. I'm going to name individuals. 2 risks, that I don't get them all named before the time runs out. Second risk, I'm going to miss somebody out. But here I go, and can I say in advance, if I've missed you out, I'm going to get back to you in another opportunity. I want to pay great tribute to Ilche and Raja Muzarevsky, now life members of our great party. They've been staffing the booths at Warilla for decades now. Great friends, great champions of Labor. Lauren Leonard at Warilla Mount Warrigal as well. Jan Merriman of Oak Flats, a wonderful supporter, a magnificent human being, had some family tragedy that she's had to deal with over the last couple of years, but turns out to support us on election day. Marie Duffy Moon and Mick Moon, again, great champions, also dealing with family challenges and caring challenges, but we're out there every day. Robin Harvey, what a beauty. I describe him as the bloke who has summer thongs and winter thongs, summer shorts and winter shorts, out there in the middle of winter election campaigning for me. Tom Hawker, a magnificent volunteer as well. Boris Baraldi and his entire family, great friends, great supporters, thank you so much. Moira Hamilton, also a councillor, thank you for your support. Gary Shaw, Jim Pearce and his partner Adele Flood, magnificent humans, thank you for your support. Denise Hadley, Arthur Hurst, Michael Ord, Brian Forbes, a very old mate of mine, Louise Hogan, Jade Jolliffe, single mum out there, knocked off from work, knocked off from uni, and would be out there doing those, you know what pre-polls like, Deputy Speaker, long hours, often raining up to our ankles in mud. She was out there on pre-poll helping me. Really thankful for her support. Joanna Kubota, Sandra Matrevsky, just had a child but still out there supporting. Marlene Collegia, Alice Scott, not a party member but a real trooper, a battler. Everyone in her community knows Alice and always been out there supporting. Christine Okanowski out at Berkeley, Maria DiCarlo, fantastic supporter over many, many years. My mate Lewis Parnas, a stalwart of the Maltese community in the George Cross Falcon Club, big supporter over in Cringilla. Emerson Burke and David Hayden, John Najjar, Rebecca Dial, Wendy and Bob Turford, absolute troopers. My old mate Simon Zulian, former staffer but long-time stalwart, great support. Alice Quinn, James O'Malley, Kristen Dawson and her partner Marguerite, again, wonderful champions of the community, great supporters. Adam Byrne, Don Kelly and family, Carol Forglin, I should say, Aidan Roberts, David Delapina, roped in by his son who works for me, John Williamson, Nick Horgan, Warren Wiseman, Charlie Habazin, tough couple of years for Charlie. He lost his wife at the beginning of COVID. Our thoughts go out to you, Charlie. Thanks for turning up and thanks for your support, mate. The Wilson clan, nothing goes on in Port Kembla and the whereabouts without the say-so of the Wilson clan. Absolute troopers. Michael, James, Norma, the whole crew, love you dearly, great supporters. Rhonda Jones, Julie Allen, Jeff McAdam, couldn't have got through without your support, Jeff. Thank you so much. Lila Best, I forgot to mention Michael in the Wilson clan, but Michael Wilson, geez, I'll be in trouble at the next Port Kembla branch meeting if I don't give him a shout out. Dana Nels, magnificent human being, runs the Oak Flats Neighbourhood Centre, but also the president of our FEC. Robbie Petreski and his family. He's a councillor, a champion of the Macedonian community. George Dimitrevsky, Vasil Kukovsky, Gotche Angeleski, well known with his community broadcast in the Macedonian community. Laura McKay, Josh Leonard, Matthew Badcock, Roy Caddick, Ray Bernasconi, Hetty and Robert Cummins, Jim David and his partner, Bernard Pay David, again, out there, rain, hail and shine during pre-poll. Thank you so much, very grateful. Here's a name many will recognise, Gary Punch, former member of this place, moved down south got good sense and moved down south to my electorate, now resides over in Warilla, very nice place, and was grateful for his support. Madeline Baker, an absolute trooper, coordinated the Southern Highland branch booth rosters. A damn cold place to campaign in a winter election, I can tell you, particularly on a wet evening. Thanks, Madeline. Eric Savage, Dean Cowgill, Ross Hanna, Graham and Linda McLaughlin, all of these people very dear to me. Phil Yeo, Rodney Cavalier, absolute stalwarts, Terry Hanna, Mark Coles, Judy McLean, Ed Gilchrist. I'll do something really risky here. I'm going to name three people: Angus Braden, Oscar Durst and Leo Schwartz, students at Barrel High School. They would knock off, before school they'd come and set up pre-poll. They'd go and do their day's school, and then after school they'd come and do pre-poll in the evening, shut up and take the signs and everything home. Big shout out to you guys, wonderful human beings, and thank you so much. Kerry Burston, Jane Miller, Peter Nelson, Christine Godwin, Jeff Lapidos, Anella Wheatley, Doug and Kathy Blunt, Jim Gasson, Bronwyn Willits, Paul Totman, Denise Welsh, Stuart Perry, Stephen Clark, Mick Jones, all fantastic contributions. My old mate Glenn Van Dien, rain, hail and shine. Rowena Perry, Maury O'Sullivan, I've known since I was a kid, a stalwart of the Southern Highlands branch, a great asset if you've got constituents who need to be spoken to in Gaelic. Maurice, your man, absolute trooper and a wonderful human. Dave Kent, fantastic, great fundraiser up in the Highlands as well, sells a mean raffle ticket. Penny Newliff, Hazel Williams, Margaret Higgins, Michael Lucy, David Baker, Barbara Baker, Warren and Dawn Glace. Warren's had his challenges over the last 3 years but turned up to help the cause. Barry Costin, Dom Martino, Leonie Stone, Christine Miller, Marilyn Raby, Roy and Ann Elburn, thank you so much. Peter Rowe, Jenny Bailey, Les Dawes, thank you so much for your support, and Mary Ann, Alec Hall, Ben Hancock, Michael Vilcheski, Liam Turner, Harvey Sheed, Glenn Hayes, Trudy Gear, Sally Stevenson, Sally Horton, Emma Madison, Rebecca Chapman, Paula Lustos, Barry Purcell, Robin Petreski, Dante Volchevsky, Steve Numovsky, Mick Galligan, Greg Hanna, Vassal Kitch and Alistair and Michelle Graham. And a big shout out, I've got to say, to Eli and Annie Harris. My staff, John Ryan, Tom Eagleton, Jared Delapina, Tiana Myers, Linda Campbell, Ella Akyol, Roman Rostovsky, Ben Maffarden, Boris Baraldi and Sarah Al-Arnouz. To all of my colleagues, parliamentary who supported, and councillors, thank you so much. I wouldn't be here without your great support. And anyone I missed, I'll come back to you.
The debate is adjourned and will be made an order of the day for the next sitting. I call the member for Lyne.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion.
And I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today on the 40th anniversary to commemorate the Ash Wednesday bushfires that struck across my home state of South Australia and, of course, Victoria on this day 40 years ago. Ash Wednesday being the 16th of February 1983. There were 75 lives lost across the nation from various fires. In my home state of South Australia, 28 people tragically perished, 14 of those in the Adelaide Hills, adjacent to my own electorate of Sturt in the member for Mayo's electorate, and 3 of those fatalities in South Australia were very brave members of the Country Fire Service who, of course, proactively put themselves in harm's way to protect our communities. 40 years later, the scars of Ash Wednesday are still very real in South Australia, and my electorate of Sturt, incorporating the hills face of the Adelaide Hills, where very significant blazes burnt on that day, you can still see remnants of the destruction that occurred. And it is a very emotional day today in South Australia. Many people still have stories of their own experiences of that day and or that of loved ones. Across the nation, there was more than 500,000 hectares burnt, 3,700 buildings, 2,400 of those people's homes. And nationally, as I say, the death toll was 75 lives. On this anniversary, it's an opportunity not just to commemorate and remember, but also commit ourselves to the ongoing vigilance that we need when it comes to bushfire preparedness across this nation. There is not a corner of continental Australia where the risk of bushfire doesn't in some way exist, and we understand it, of course, as being a part of life in this country, but we also know that the risk and damage of bushfire can be mitigated if we take sensible precautions as a community and ensure that we're investing in the sorts of resources that the brave people that fight these fires need. And I take the opportunity on the 40th anniversary to recommit myself as a leader in my community, particularly the Hills Face suburbs of my electorate of Sturt, to ensuring that the awareness is higher than ever about the need for proper bushfire preparedness plans. Everyone in a high-risk suburb needs to have a plan. They need to know what they need to do to put in place fuel reduction strategies and obviously other mitigation efforts that can assist to reduce the risk to their property and to their family, but also that has to include a plan in the worst case for evacuation. And some of the learnings from not just Ash Wednesday but other bushfires are how vital it is and what the difference is for people that have got a plan, so that if and when the threat reaches a trigger point, that people are ready to prioritise first and foremost the safety of them and their families. So as we commemorate that day, a mere 5 weeks before I was born, 40 years ago today, we remember those that sadly perished, the destruction of livestock, property, and of course 500,000 hectares of land across the nation. We thank the heroes in our community that fight these fires, many of whom are volunteers. We thank them for their service, not just what they do when fire strikes, but also what they do to prepare our communities and mitigate the risk of fire right throughout each and every year. And we commit ourselves to ensuring, in this beautiful country Australia, where the risk of bushfire is ever present, to make sure that we as communities and as families are always prepared to make sure that we're protecting our property to the best of our capacity, but most importantly, we have a plan to protect ourselves and our loved ones by making sure we've got a plan for whenever bushfires may strike in our communities.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And before I commence on my adjournment, can I just echo from all of the people on this side of the House we join in acknowledging all those who suffered loss during those fires, and we also acknowledge the sacrifice that volunteers made on that day, putting themselves at risk in that fire, and acknowledging that they do so right around the country on many occasions. So we join ourselves with those comments. Can I, Deputy Speaker, note that suicide is the leading cause of death for young Australians aged between 15 and 24. 9 young Australians die by suicide every day, and the number is growing every year. These are truly tragic statistics. The pandemic and lockdowns took a heavy toll, with 42% of people between 18 and 24 reporting serious levels of psychological distress. Young workers were hit hardest. They were more likely to work casually, and they were more likely to be affected by jobs affected by border closures and lockdowns. As a nation, we have much work ahead of us, but there are some successes that I would like to acknowledge today. Since its establishment in 1985, Youth in Search, which is behind this week's End Youth Suicide Week, had supported 32,000 at-risk youth to overcome trauma and mental health issues and to protect them against suicide, drug and alcohol abuse and delinquency. A significant proportion of the youth supported are from culturally and linguistically diverse communities like those in my electorate. As a federal MP of one of the most diverse electorates, I am acutely aware of the targeting of people from African backgrounds. Racism has a terrible health on mental health, particularly for young people. I would like to acknowledge some powerful advocacy work among culturally and linguistically diverse communities by young people in Fraser. Mohammed Semra, a Sudanese-born refugee, is no stranger to racism. He made international headlines when, as a 16-year-old, he and 6 friends of African heritage were stopped from entering an Apple store at High Point because staff were concerned that the group might steal something. They made a video, and after the video went onto the internet, it went viral. Apple CEO Tim Cook apologised personally. He called the incident unacceptable and announced that store leadership teams around the world, starting in Australia, would be refreshing their training on inclusion and customer engagement. What an amazing global impact for a 16-year-old to have. But Mohammed continued with his efforts and is having an ongoing local impact. For Mohammed and his friends, the racism and unconscious bias that they experience are just part of their daily life. At school, he and his friends would often be referred to as gang members. When handing in written assignments, they were sometimes questioned about whether they had copied each other's work. Mohammed's experience that day in Apple has inspired him to go down the activist path. He became school captain at Maribyrnong College, a first for an African student from a refugee background. And after he graduated from school, he co-founded Endeavour Youth Australia, which works to tackle racism and unconscious bias in schools and to help young people from diverse backgrounds to fulfil their leadership potential. Endeavour Youth Australia works with schools all over Melbourne, but mainly in the West. Mohammed mentors disengaged students and, along with the Education Department, develops programs to support students and staff on how to have conversations about racism to understand the damage that words can cause. Mohammed says that students from diverse backgrounds want to take part in leadership activities, but it is very hard to be the first in line. He says when kids don't see themselves or their culture represented or accepted at school, it becomes easier to disassociate. Mentoring plays a key role, with all of the facilitators at Endeavour Youth Australia having lived experiences of racism. He says we look like them, we have similar experience, we have persevered and have broken through barriers. We show the kids how to use their experiences to build resilience, whether it is to succeed at school or later in life. Last week, Endeavour Youth ran a multicultural youth leadership conference attended by more than 500 students from 20 schools. Students heard from young leaders in a range of industries and attended workshops on digital leadership, on diversity and resilience and tackling racism. And last month I had the privilege of attending a futsal tournament organised by Endeavour Youth. The women's final, which I presented the trophy for, dramatically went to overtime. Not only was it a great sporting event with more than 100 young men and women competing, it was a wonderful celebration of multiculturalism.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the Shadow Minister.
Thanks very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, within my electorate of Deakin and indeed throughout Australia, people are suffering a cost of living crisis that I have not seen in my time in this place. And I must say, Madam Deputy Speaker, in looking at the agenda of the government over the first 2 weeks of this parliament and indeed the activities of the Prime Minister over summer, what electors in Deakin are seeing, what I think Australians are seeing, is a fundamental lack of focus from this government on the most pressing issue that Australians are now suffering from. Madam Deputy Speaker, we all know that Australians with mortgages, the millions of Australians with mortgages, are seeing and have seen interest rate rises, 9 consecutive rises, 8 consecutive rises since this government came to office. For a household with an average mortgage, an increase of $16,000 a year. We're seeing record inflation, the most recent figures of 7.8%, which highlight that the government has lost control of what is one of the most corrosive aspects of any economic situation. Madam Deputy Speaker, we see the Prime Minister over summer, all he wanted to do was talk about The Voice or hang out at the tennis. We see no urgency from this government on the most pressing issue that faces people every day. It faces them every time they go to the supermarket. There are Australians now who make decisions in the supermarket about what they go without. Parents who will go without themselves so they can provide for their children. We're seeing the consequences as well of a government that's broken its promises in relation to reducing power prices. The Prime Minister said on 97 occasions before the election that he would deliver a reduction of $275 a year. It wasn't a slip of the tongue once or twice. He said it 97 times. And at the very least, we're now seeing households not seeing increases of hundreds of dollars, but seeing increases of thousands of dollars. I had a constituent last week send me a letter that they'd received from their energy provider, and it read as follows. Hello, and I won't say the name. As you may have heard, energy prices have been going up. On the 1st of February, your natural gas rates are going up. We understand this isn't the news you want to hear and a whole lot of other flowery language. We estimate that the new rates will cost you $602.74 more, including GST, a year. That's $600 a year more. And that's just gas. That doesn't also include electricity. So we're seeing inflation out of control, which is leading to higher mortgage interest rates, which again, for the average house, is $16,000 a year more out the door on their mortgages. We're seeing in every single good and service and product, staple products at supermarkets, rising with inflationary levels higher than they've been for 33 years. We're seeing power prices not only not going down by $275, as the Prime Minister promised on 97 occasions, but going up by thousands of dollars. So you would have thought that in returning to Parliament for the first fortnight of the year, that there would be an obsession from the government on these issues, an absolute focus on addressing these issues. But instead we see a Prime Minister seemingly unconcerned about the economic situation being faced by households in this country. A Prime Minister who's very self-satisfied, very pleased, very happy, enjoying the traps of office, enjoying nights at the tennis, hanging out with musicians, while Australians are doing it hard. This was a Prime Minister who said he'd show up. This is a Prime Minister who said he'd deliver $275 price reductions in power prices. This was a Prime Minister who said he'd deliver cheaper mortgages. So on every single measure, we're seeing a Labor Party and a government that I think is not only not showing the focus that is necessary, but is incapable of addressing these challenges. We know, and Australians have seen it before, you always pay more under Labor. The economy always tanks under Labor. Labor claim it's all a bit of hard luck and bad luck for them and bad timing. Bad luck seems to follow Labor, and Australians pay the price.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It is extraordinary to rise to speak after a speech given by a former minister from a party that was in government for the better part of a decade, and from a party that came to Parliament with the urgent recall of Parliament in December to put a cap on power prices and voted against it, and yet just spent some of his precious speaking time trying to suggest that the Albanese government has done nothing to deal with rising energy prices, having voted against the measure to reduce rising energy prices and having been part of a government and a minister, no less, in that government, where the report that was given to the government before the last election in May last year about increasing energy prices was, what was it again? Hidden from the Australian public. A minister who was a minister for housing, and 8 months after his tenure, we are facing a housing affordability and accessibility crisis, and somehow thinks that the people in his electorate and the people of Australia are going to believe that that just sprung out of nowhere in the last 8 months and had nothing to do with the bad policies and lack of policies of the government he was a part of. I know it's the last day of 2 weeks of sitting and we're all a little bit tired because we've been working so hard, we want to go home, but it's not really an excuse for the member for Deakin to come into this chamber and spend more time personally attacking the Prime Minister than actually talking about the issues that matter and acknowledging what's happened this year. Oh, cheaper medicines came in from the 1st of January, the biggest cut in the price of the PBS in 75 years. Cheaper childcare starts on the 1st of June or July. Anyway, very soon. Huge impact on the cost of living. What happened after we got elected last year? Because we made submissions to the Fair Work Commission and were brave enough to say that workers on the lowest incomes needed to have more money, the minimum wage went up. And to return to the energy price cap and the evidence so far that the increases in energy prices have been reduced because of the urgent measures that we took in December that the opposition voted against. So to just imply that this government is not dealing with cost of living pressures is just like fanciful Alice in Wonderland garbage, to be completely frank to this chamber. And what have we done this week? What are our priorities? Housing Future Fund, National Reconstruction Fund. We've got a safeguard mechanism, paid parental leave. One of those four got support from the opposition. One of those four. We are in a crisis of affordable and accessible housing, and we've all been talking about it for a long time. I've told this chamber a number of times about this amazing young man, Jack, in my electorate, who was homeless and is now a social worker with the council and is part of a campaign for more youth crisis accommodation in my electorate. I talked about it all through the last term of government, who did nothing about it. So excited this week to see the state Labor government has stepped up and is investing in this space. Our excellent state member for Frankston, Paul Edbrook, announced the state government is delivering more than $50 million in funding to provide safe and stable accommodation for young people at risk of homelessness. Frankston is going to be home to one of 10 new youth housing projects that receive funding, and this is huge for my community. We have a state government stepping up to break the cycle of homelessness, to talk about and deliver safe, secure housing, particularly for young people, and a federal Albanese Labor government, which I'm proud to be a member of, with the Housing Future Fund, which is going to make a massive difference, a $10 billion fund, and we have an opposition that is voting against it, and a Greens party that apparently doesn't support it because they want to do other things. It's just unbelievably wrong.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Melbourne.
There was so much hope at the last election for those of us who want climate action. Finally, the guy who brought a lump of coal into Parliament and wanted to lead a gas-led recovery in the middle of a climate crisis was gone. And we saw a record number of people switch their vote to the Greens. Our vote went up, some independents' vote went up, and the parties that backed more coal and gas, Labor and Liberal, saw their vote go backwards. And we now have a parliament that can take the climate action that this country and the world needs. And we got off to a reasonably good start last year when, with the Greens' support, we managed to make a climate change bill better and take a first step on the road to tackling the climate emergency. And again, with the Greens' support, we managed to get legislation through to make electric vehicles cheaper and to stop propping up the fossil fuel industry. And so there was real hope from so many people who wanted to see Australia take the action we need to stop the droughts and the floods and the fires from getting worse, and to ensure that our kids and our grandkids have a chance of living in something that is like the safe climate that people of generations before have known. And so how utterly disappointing it was to find Labor coming up with legislation that said they want to make the climate crisis worse by opening new coal and gas mines. There are 117 new coal and gas mines in the pipeline, and Labor is bringing legislation to Parliament to say they want them to go ahead, to be able to go ahead under their new so-called safeguard mechanism. And then they released documentation to put it in black and white last year to say every single one of the big new climate bombs that Scott Morrison backed, they also want to open up as well. Beetaloo, Scarborough, Browse, these climate bombs that contain years' worth of the country's pollution, they want to light the fuse on those as well. There is a very clear message that is coming from the world scientists, from the International Energy Agency, from the UN Secretary-General, from the young people who are marching on the street, and that is, to have any chance of getting the climate crisis under control, we have to stop opening coal and gas mines. You can't fix a problem while you're making the problem worse. You can't put out the fire while you're pouring petrol on it. And so the Greens have put to the government a very reasonable offer. We said there's real problems with your legislation because you're allowing these big polluters to keep on polluting as long as they offset it by buying some tree planting permits on the other side of the country. You've got weak targets in your legislation that would see the Great Barrier Reef get completely cooked. It's Tony Abbott's old mechanism that you're trying to reheat and we're not confident it'll do the job. But we've said to the government, we will put those concerns aside and give your scheme a chance if you agree with one thing. Stop opening new coal and gas mines, Labor. Stop making the problem that we're trying to fix worse by adding years and decades and countries' worth of pollution to the problem. I challenge any member in this place on the Labor side to go to one of those areas that was hit by floods or fires or droughts and explain to them why opening a new coal and gas mine in the middle of a climate crisis is a good idea. The member for Sydney has been out saying a few things today. Well, I want the member for Sydney to go to all of her constituents in Sydney and tell them why Labor is preparing to die in a ditch over the right to open new coal and gas mines in the middle of the climate crisis. The member for Richmond needs to go to her flood-hit constituents and tell them that Labor is saying they want to open up new coal and gas projects. The member for Macnamara needs to go to his constituents, including those who are facing the threats of rising sea levels, and say, no, Labor wants to open new coal and gas mines and that they're prepared to make it an absolute condition. We are in a climate crisis. People know coal and gas are the main causes of the climate crisis. It is a very sensible proposition to say stop opening new projects. The offer is there for Labor. It's on the table. We can pass this legislation next week. Just stop opening new coal and gas projects, please.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Blair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Last night and this morning I was pleased to vote for the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, which will make a big difference in my local community. We're talking about 30,000 new social and affordable houses in the first 5 years. It will have also 4,000 homes for women and children impacted by domestic and family violence. And for nearly a quarter of a century before I came to this place, I practiced in family law and dealt with women and children who were suffering and experiencing domestic and family violence. So that particular commitment is near and dear to my heart. Also, the $30 million that we're committing to assist veterans for building housing and fund specialist services for veterans comes about very much from the work I did as the Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. And we've seen 1 in 10 people last night sleeping rough or homeless a veteran. We honour them with medals, we should honour them with houses. So we need to support them. And I'm very pleased that this particular legislation passed the House of Representatives last night and this morning. Tomorrow morning I will be at the Future of Health Conference in Springfield, and I want to thank the Springfield City Group for having the vision to put that particular conference on. The Ipswich and West Moreton region is the fastest growing health district in Queensland and has very high rates of mental illness, and that's why as a federal MP I've been advocating for more services to meet the needs of our local community. I was pleased to announce an Albanese Labor government will deliver a $14 million head-to-health adult mental health centre in Ipswich with the Darling Downs West Moreton PHN to fund and establish a facility, and we're going to do that. Since the election, we've committed $1 million to support youth mental health services at Ipswich Headspace, which I was proud to open 10 years ago, by the way, with the current minister. So I'm looking forward to seeing the Federal Assistant Minister for Mental Health, the Honourable Emma McBride, tomorrow in Ipswich, where she will be speaking and the keynote speaker at that particular conference. I've been advocating for a better deal for local businesses, farmers and residents in Ipswich and the Somerset region for a very long time, and also in the Corona Downs region, which came into my electorate a couple of elections ago. So I'm very pleased to see that Labor committed during the election to fix the NBN and to get rid of the Coalition's ageing copper network, which held our community back by slow and unreliable broadband. We're investing $2.4 $4 billion to expand NBN full fibre upgrades to 1.5 million Australian premises, over 660,000 in regional communities like my electorate. And that's why I'm so pleased this week to see the latest tranche of the 1 million premises will be eligible for full fibre upgrades to access gigabyte speeds of 20 by 2025, and 3,200 homes and businesses across Ipswich suburbs of North Ipswich, Pine Mountain, Carolee, Yamanto, Collingwood Park and Springfield, and rural towns like Rosewood and Lowood, but also Corona Downs region in the Brisbane area, which is in my electorate as well. So I'm very pleased to see the Albanese Labor government fixing the NBN for our local community. One thing I am supporting in that Corona Downs region is the Queensland Government's application under the Disaster Ready Fund for a Corona Downs community hub, recommended by former Governor Paul de Jersey, the need for community hubs as a result of natural disasters and floods. That report came about, commissioned by the Brisbane City Council, and I know this Corona Downs community hub has the support of the local councillor, Greg Adaman, an LNP member, and also the local LNP state MP, Dr Christian Rowan. And I've been working with them in a bipartisan way, and I thank the Deputy Premier of Queensland's office for the tremendous cooperation I've got from them, and also the local Corona Downs and Mount Crosby community. So I look forward to that application. I urge the Minister for Disaster Management, the Honourable Murray Watt, to actually support that particular application. It will be located at Mount Crosby State School, which will be upgraded as a result of that application, and I hope that will be successful. And I also thank Senator Watt for the commitment that we made together of $4 million, including $1.5 million under the Disaster Ready Fund, for the Ipswich Show Society, which is the main evacuation centre in Ipswich. We've experienced floods and fires in my electorate, so this is particularly important and a great initiative of the Albanese Labor government. I support also the funding that we're providing for flood research, $50,000 from the federal government, $50,000 from the state, $20,000 from the Ipswich City Council. We need to work out how our community is impacted and improve flood resilience in Ipswich.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those in favour say aye. All those against? The motion is carried. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 10:30 a.m. on Monday the 6th of March.